I've always been drawn to the outdoors. There's something about the quiet of the woods, the smell of pine, and the crisp air that makes me feel alive. It's a feeling I never get in the city, so I'd head out for weekends, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends. But this trip was different. I didn't expect what happened, and I'll never forget it. I decided to camp solo this time, something I'd done plenty of times before. It wasn't far from my usual spots, just a few miles deep into a forest area I knew well. It was supposed to be a simple, peaceful weekend, away from everything. I packed my gear the night before, double-checking everything from the tent to the sleeping bag, the stove, and my first aid kit. The weather forecast was perfect. Clear skies, cool nights, and no sign of rain. I was ready. The hike in was beautiful as expected. The trail was quiet, with only the rustling of leaves underfoot and the distant call of birds breaking the silence. I didn't see a soul for miles. That was fine by me. I preferred it that way. The solitude gave me a sense of peace I couldn't find anywhere else. The forest around me was thick, the kind of place that felt like it had secrets hidden within its trees. I wasn't superstitious, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different that day. Maybe it was the silence. When I reached my campsite, I found a nice, flat spot near a creek. It was perfect for setting up my tent. The sound of water flowing was soothing. I could hear it as I worked, setting up my camp, gathering firewood, and organizing my things. The sun started to dip behind the trees, and the shadows stretched longer, the air turning cooler. I got the fire started, watching the flames flicker and dance. As the night grew darker, I felt that familiar sense of calm wash over me. It was just me, the crackling fire, and the wild around me. But as the night deepened, something started to feel off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. Maybe it was the way the wind picked up, rattling the branches above me, or the occasional snap of a twig in the distance. It wasn't anything that made me think I was in danger, but it was enough to make me uneasy. I tried to shake it off. I was used to the sounds of the woods. I pulled out my stove and started making dinner, trying to ignore the feeling gnawing at the back of my mind. As I ate, I kept glancing around, feeling like I was being watched. It was strange because I knew no one else was around. The thought was absurd, but it wouldn't go away. I didn't want to give in to the fear, so I got up and walked around the camp, trying to distract myself. I checked my gear, making sure everything was in its place. I wandered down to the creek, the sound of rushing water helping to calm me down. But then I noticed something odd. There were footprints along the edge of the creek. Fresh ones. They weren't mine. I froze, staring at the prints. They were too big to be from a deer or any other animal I could think of. And they didn't look like the boots I wore. My heart rate quickened. I bent down to examine them closer. The prints were recent, the edges still soft, but there was no sign of any other disturbance in the area. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe it was another hiker who had passed through recently. But the more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I felt. I'd been alone on this trail for hours, and I hadn't seen a single person. I walked back to my camp, feeling a sense of urgency in my movements. I didn't want to panic, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I checked my gear again, the fire still crackling beside me, but I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, as if expecting someone, or something, to be standing there, just out of sight. The night passed slowly after that. I tried to fall asleep, but every sound seemed amplified in the stillness of the forest. The crackling of the fire, the wind rustling the leaves, and the distant call of an owl kept me on edge. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling of my tent, listening intently. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke with a start. My watch said it was well past midnight. I couldn't remember if I had heard something or if it was just a bad dream, but I felt like there was someone nearby. My heart raced as I lay perfectly still, straining to hear. Then I heard it again, a rustling, footsteps, not just one or two, but a series of them moving closer. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. I held my breath, waiting, listening. The footsteps came closer, crunching over the leaves. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I grabbed my flashlight, but I didn't want to make a sound. I didn't want to give away that I was awake, that I knew someone or something was out there. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. I could hear them, the soft crunch of leaves, the slow exhale of someone breathing. I held my flashlight in my hand, but I didn't dare turn it on. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the footsteps moved away. I heard them fading into the distance, down the trail, getting quieter and quieter until they were gone. I waited, tense and alert, before I finally allowed myself to breathe again. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When dawn finally broke, I got up early, packed up my camp, and started the hike back to my car. I didn't care about the beauty of the sunrise or the tranquility of the forest. All I could think about was the footsteps, the feeling that someone who shouldn't have been there, had been watching me. The hike out felt endless. The sun climbed higher, but I barely noticed. I kept checking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following me. But the woods were quiet, as they always were in the early morning. When I reached the trailhead, I breathed a sigh of relief. I'll never forget that feeling. The feeling of being watched, of knowing deep down that something wasn't right. But what scared me the most was what I found later. When I got home, I checked my boots. I had worn them all day, and they were muddy from the hike. But when I got back to my car and took them off to change, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The mud was different. It wasn't from the trail. It was fresh, and it was from the creek. I was out there, deep in the woods, where the trees are tall and the sunlight barely touches the forest floor. I'd never felt more alone in my life, and it wasn't the kind of solitude that brought peace. It was the kind that made your skin itch, your nerves jump at every sound. I had gone camping in the middle of nowhere, thinking it would be a perfect weekend to escape everything.
No distractions, no noise.
Just me and nature. The air was crisp, and the scent of pine filled my nostrils as I trudged through the thick underbrush. My tent was already set up when I got there, tucked between a few massive trees near a small clearing. A quiet stream bubbled nearby, and the whole scene was like something from a picture, calm and serene. I tried to shake off the unease creeping up on me. It was just my mind playing tricks, right? I had no reason to feel like something wasn't right, but I couldn't ignore the little voice in the back of my head, the one telling me I shouldn't be there. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that made the woods feel even darker. I built a small fire, its crackling flames the only sound that broke the eerie silence of the forest. The light danced across the trees, throwing strange shadows that seemed to move. As the night deepened, the temperature dropped. I sat there, staring into the fire, trying to calm my racing thoughts. It was just a regular camping trip. There was nothing to be afraid of. But then I heard it, a faint rustling sound from somewhere deeper in the woods. Could have been an animal, but the noise was too deliberate, too consistent. It wasn't just the wind. I tried to shrug it off, telling myself that animals were curious creatures, especially at night. Maybe it was just a deer or something. But then there was a snap of a twig. Not an animal this time. It was louder, sharper, closer. My heart started pounding in my chest. I scanned the tree line, trying to see anything, but the darkness was thick, impenetrable. The firelight barely reached beyond the camp's edge. Another snap, My breath hitched, and I stood up, gripping the pocket knife I'd brought just in case. The rustling sound continued, moving around the perimeter of my campsite, as if something was circling me. A cold chill ran down my spine, and I couldn't fight the urge to glance behind me. Nothing, just the quiet, dark woods. But the feeling in the pit of my stomach kept gnawing at me, getting stronger, more insistent. I wasn't alone out here. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, that I was just being paranoid. But the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. I kept my eyes trained on the tree line, watching, waiting. Then it happened. A shadow moved between two trees, barely noticeable, but I saw it. It was large, too large to be an animal. My pulse quickened. I told myself to stay calm, that I was being ridiculous. But my body wasn't listening. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to leave, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. The shape moved again, closer this time, and I could hear the faintest sound of footsteps on the forest floor. Whoever or whatever was out there was getting closer. I was no longer alone. My heart raced as I fumbled for the flashlight in my bag. My hands were shaking, and I cursed myself for not thinking to keep it nearby. I finally grabbed it and flicked it on, casting a bright beam into the darkness. The beam cut through the trees, illuminating the space around me. Nothing, just shadows and the occasional swaying of branches. But the unease remained, pressing down on me like a weight. I sat down again, keeping the flashlight on the perimeter, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The footsteps stopped, and the woods around me went eerily silent. The fire crackled, casting brief bursts of light, but nothing else moved. I started to wonder if I had imagined it all, if it was just a trick of the light, the wind playing games with my senses. Then the sound came again, a low, growling noise, not from an animal, but something more human. I stood up, adrenaline pumping through my veins as I scanned the woods with frantic eyes. My hand clutched the knife so tight my fingers went numb. Another snap, closer. A shape emerged from the trees, this time more visible. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was tall, maybe 6 feet or more, with a broad frame. His clothes were ragged, and he moved with a strange, jerky gait, like he was unfamiliar with walking. His face was obscured by a thick, matted beard, and his hair hung in long tangles around his shoulders. He stopped just outside the reach of the firelight, his body hidden in the shadows. I couldn't see his eyes, but I could feel his stare on me, cold and unnerving. My throat went dry, and I took a step back, my knife raised. The man didn't move. He just stood there, watching me. The growl came again, this time louder, almost like a guttural laugh. It sent chills down my spine. I took another step back, unsure of what to do. Should I run? Should I try to confront him? I wasn't sure, but I knew one thing: this wasn't right. Everything about this felt wrong. The man's hand twitched, and I flinched. My breath came faster, my eyes darting around the campsite, looking for an escape. But there was nowhere to go. The man stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, and I instinctively backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. I don't know how long we stood there, locked in some kind of silent standoff. My legs were trembling, and the flashlight's beam flickered in my hand. The man never spoke, never moved closer, but I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. My mind raced, thinking of all the possible outcomes, none of them good. Suddenly, the sound of a distant car engine broke the silence, growing louder. The man's eyes flickered toward the sound, and I could see his body tense. Without another word, he turned and melted back into the shadows of the trees. I waited, watching the spot where he had been, my pulse still racing, my breath shallow. But he didn't come back. The car engine grew louder, and moments later, Headlights cut through the darkness, sweeping across the woods. The sound of the car grew closer, and I realized it was heading toward my camp. I didn't wait around. I grabbed my bag, my tent, everything I could carry, and ran toward the road. I didn't look back. When I finally reached the road, the car was there, an old truck with two guys inside. They looked at me with confusion, but I didn't care. I jumped into the truck, not caring who they were, just knowing that I needed to leave. As we drove away, I looked back one last time. The woods were dark, quiet, no man in the shadows.
No strange sounds.
Just the deep, oppressive silence. I wasn't sure what had happened, but I knew I wasn't going back there. Not ever. The truck dropped me off at the nearest town, and I made my way home, my body still trembling with the memory of that night. I don't know what that man was doing out there or what he wanted. Maybe he was just some lost wanderer, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. The forest had its secrets, and I had no intention of uncovering them. Some things are better left unknown. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a break from the hectic routine of daily life. Just me, the woods, and the sounds of nature. I had always found peace in the wilderness, the quiet that surrounded you, the rhythm of the wind through the trees, the crackling of a campfire at night. But this time was different. I decided to go camping alone, something I had done many times before. I loved the solitude, the way it gave me a chance to clear my mind, think, and just be away from people. I packed my gear carefully, making sure I had everything I would need for the 2 days I planned to be out there. A tent, sleeping bag, food, a couple of flashlights, my knife, and a few other essentials. It wasn't a fancy trip, but it didn't need to be. I drove out to a remote area I had discovered on a previous trip. It was a secluded spot, miles from the nearest trailhead, surrounded by dense forest. I had to park the car a ways back and walk to the campsite, but that didn't bother me. The trail was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only person left on Earth. But that was why I loved it, the isolation. As I hiked through the woods, I could feel the cool breeze against my face, the smell of pine and fresh earth filling my lungs. The trail was overgrown in parts, and I had to push through thick bushes to make my way forward. After about an hour of walking, I arrived at the clearing where I planned to set up camp. It was perfect, quiet, secluded, and just the right distance from the small creek nearby. I quickly set up my tent, making sure it was properly anchored to the ground. I had plenty of time before nightfall, so I decided to explore a little. I wandered down the creek, following it as it wound through the forest. The sound of the water was calming, but there was something about the way the trees closed in around me that made the air feel thicker, heavier. It wasn't a bad feeling, just different, like something was watching, but I shrugged it off. After all, it was just me and nature. As the evening approached, I headed back to my camp. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the trees, and the first stars began to twinkle in the sky. I built a small fire and sat down, enjoying the warmth as the cool air started to settle in. I had brought along a simple dinner, some canned food and snacks, and ate quietly, listening to the sounds of the forest around me. It wasn't long before the darkness fully enveloped the camp. The fire crackled, sending occasional sparks into the air, and the shadows of the trees stretched long across the clearing. I felt at ease, even though the darkness seemed to bring with it an eerie silence. The only sounds now were the occasional snap of a twig or the distant rustling of leaves. I lay down in my tent, the warmth of the fire still lingering in the cool night air. But as I drifted off to sleep, a strange feeling washed over me. It wasn't fear exactly, but more of an unsettling sensation. It felt like I wasn't alone, like something was out there, watching. I tried to shake off the feeling, convincing myself it was just my imagination running wild. The forest could feel strange at night, after all, but I had camped here before and had never felt anything like this. Still, I couldn't help but glance around the tent, making sure everything was secure. That night, sleep came in fits and starts. I would drift off for a few minutes, only to wake up suddenly, feeling like I had missed something important. It wasn't until I heard a faint sound, like the soft crunch of footsteps on the ground, that I truly woke up. My heart skipped a beat as I strained to listen, my ears straining in the darkness. The sound was faint but unmistakable. Someone or something was out there walking around my camp. I held my breath, not daring to move. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Maybe it was just an animal, a deer or a raccoon, but the sound was too deliberate, too human. It didn't make sense. I felt my pulse quicken as I slowly reached for the flashlight beside me. My hand trembled as I turned it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. I scanned the clearing, but there was nothing there. The fire was still burning low, casting its flickering light on the trees, but no one was in sight. The footsteps had stopped. For a moment, I just lay there, staring at the darkness, trying to calm myself. It had to be nothing. Maybe I was just hearing things, the forest playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. After what felt like hours, I finally managed to fall back asleep, my mind clouded with strange thoughts. But it wasn't a peaceful sleep. Every rustling leaf, every crack of a twig, made me jump awake, my heart pounding in my chest. I kept the flashlight on, the beam flickering every time I moved it. The sound of the forest seemed louder than before, more alive with unseen things. At some point during the night, I heard the footsteps again, this time closer, more distinct. I froze, holding my breath. The sound was unmistakable. Someone was out there, moving around my camp, circling it slowly, carefully. I waited, my hand on my knife, but I couldn't bring myself to leave the tent. I was paralyzed by fear, unsure what to do. The footsteps stopped, and for a long time, there was complete silence. I don't know how long I lay there, waiting, but eventually, exhaustion overcame me, and I fell into a restless sleep. When I woke up the next morning, the sun had risen, casting a soft light over the camp. The air was still and quiet, and everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I had checked my gear, and everything appeared undisturbed, but I couldn't forget the footsteps from the night before. I spent the morning packing up my things, determined to leave. I didn't want to stay any longer. Something about the place didn't sit right with me anymore. It felt wrong, like I was being drawn into something I didn't understand. As I gathered my things, I noticed something strange in the dirt near the edge of the camp. Footprints, but they weren't from an animal. They were human. The prints were fresh, and they led in a circular pattern around my campfire, as if someone had been walking around me while I slept. My heart raced as I stared at the footprints, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. I didn't wait any longer. I grabbed my gear, packed it into my backpack, and began the long hike back to the car. My steps were quick, and I didn't look back. Every rustle of the leaves seemed louder, more menacing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. But I didn't stop. I just kept moving. By the time I reached my car, I was sweating, my heart still racing. I jumped into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut, locking it quickly. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves, but I couldn't. I started the engine and drove away, glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. As I drove down the dirt road, away from the camp, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The further I got from that place, the better I felt. But even now, I still can't explain what happened out there. The footsteps, the feeling of being watched. I don't know who or what was out there, but I don't think I'll ever go back. I've been camping since then, but it's never been the same. Every now and then, I'll think back to that night in the woods, and I'll remember the fear I felt, the way it seemed like the forest itself was closing in around me. I'll never fully understand what happened out there, but I've learned one thing for sure. When something feels wrong, it's best to trust your instincts and get out. Started out like any other camping trip, the kind where everything feels perfect at first until it doesn't. The weather was beautiful when I first set out, the sun shining bright, the air fresh, with a cool breeze that made the leaves rustle lightly. I had packed my gear the night before, making sure everything I needed was with me. Tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, and a few snacks. I'd gone camping alone before many times, so I wasn't worried. I enjoyed the peace and quiet, the solitude of being in the woods, away from everything. This time, I chose a spot deep in the forest, a quiet, secluded area that I found on a map. It was far enough from the usual campgrounds to avoid the noise, but close enough to a small stream to hear the gentle trickle of water. I figured it would be the perfect escape for the weekend. The first couple of hours were idyllic. I found a good spot to set up my tent beside the stream, right under the shade of a few tall pine trees. The ground was soft, covered with a carpet of pine needles that made it feel almost like a mattress. After setting everything up, I sat by the fire watching the flames dance. There was something soothing about the crackling sound, and the smell of burning would fill the air. But as the sun began to dip behind the trees, the atmosphere shifted. The peacefulness that had been there earlier started to feel off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something just didn't feel right. Maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should, or the way the breeze suddenly stopped, leaving an eerie stillness. I shook it off as just my imagination. It was probably just the fact that I was alone. I'd been camping alone plenty of times, and nothing had ever happened. Still, a slight unease tugged at me, but I tried to ignore it. I decided to make some dinner, just a simple meal of dehydrated pasta and some water from the stream. The sound of the water flowing made it easier to forget the strange feeling creeping in. By the time I finished eating, the sun had set completely, and the woods were plunged into darkness. The firelight cast long, flickering shadows across the trees. I sat by the fire, trying to enjoy the crackling warmth, but my mind kept drifting back to that uneasy feeling. It was as if I wasn't alone, like someone or something was watching me. I pushed that thought aside and crawled into my tent. The fabric was thick enough to keep out the chill, and I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. I turned off my flashlight, settled down, and pulled the sleeping bag over me. The world outside felt quiet, too quiet. I could hear the wind moving through the branches, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the distant rustle of leaves. But other than that, it was dead silent. As I lay there, I kept hearing sounds. Soft at first, like twigs snapping in the distance. Maybe it was a deer or some other animal moving through the woods. I tried to ignore it, but it kept getting louder, closer. The snaps of branches, the rustle of leaves, the sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush. My heart began to race. I couldn't help but feel like whatever it wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic, like it was following me, moving around my campsite in a way that didn't feel natural. I listened closely, trying to pick out the sounds, but they were coming from different directions all at once. I felt trapped in my own mind, my thoughts spiraling. I decided to step out of the tent just to check. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe it was nothing. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent, my hand shaking as I did. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees around me. Nothing seemed out of place. No animals, no strange shapes in the woods. But that feeling was still there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I could feel my pulse quicken. I swept the flashlight over the ground around my tent, scanning for any sign of movement, but all I saw were the shadows of the trees. Still, something felt wrong. I was about to crawl back into the tent when I noticed it, a faint smell in the air. It was subtle at first, but it made my stomach turn. It was like the smell of rotten meat, something decayed and foul. I gagged and quickly covered my nose with my sleeve. It didn't make sense. There shouldn't be any dead animals nearby. The forest was too healthy for that. I decided it was best to just stay inside for the rest of the night. Maybe I'd imagined everything, and my mind was just playing tricks on me. So I crawled back into the tent, zipped it up, and tried to calm myself down. But the sounds didn't stop. They only got worse. Now, it wasn't just twigs snapping. There were footsteps, heavy ones, walking around my tent. I could hear them clearly right outside. Slow, deliberate steps, like someone was circling me, just out of sight. The smell of rot grew stronger, mingling with the scent of pine. I could barely breathe. I wasn't imagining this. Someone or something was out there. I grabbed my knife from my pack. I didn't know what I thought I could do with it, but the feeling of the blade in my hand brought me some comfort. I wasn't helpless. I had to figure out what was going on. I lay there in silence, listening, waiting for the next move. My mind raced, trying to figure out what was happening. Was someone messing with me? Was it some other camper? But then I realized it was too late for anyone else to be out here. The nearest trailhead was hours away. Then I heard something different, a whisper barely audible, but it was there. It was like someone was talking just outside the tent, too quiet to make out the words, but close enough for me to hear. My heart thudded in my chest. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. I didn't dare move. I didn't know if I should wait for daylight or try to leave now. But the longer I stayed still, the more I realized something. Whatever it was out there didn't seem to be in a hurry. It wasn't trying to attack me. It was just watching. The rest of the night passed in fits of tense silence and bursts of strange noises. I didn't sleep. I just lay there, wide-eyed, listening to every sound in the forest. Finally, at first light, I felt safe enough to leave the tent. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a pale light through the trees. The forest seemed unchanged, peaceful again, like nothing had happened. I packed up my things quickly, not wanting to linger in that spot any longer. As I left the campsite, I noticed something strange on the ground near the edge of the woods. Tracks, human tracks, but they weren't like any I'd seen before. They were deep, like they were made by someone much heavier than me, and they led off into the forest. I didn't stick around to follow them. Whatever had been out there, I didn't want to meet it. I made it back to my car, my heart finally starting to slow down. I didn't know what had happened, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't coming back to this place. The woods weren't as peaceful as they seemed, and whatever had been out there, I didn't want to find out what it really was. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a chance to escape the noise of everyday life, to step into the quiet embrace of the wilderness, the kind of peaceful retreat where you can breathe in fresh air, enjoy the stillness of nature, and maybe even learn something about yourself along the way. I had made this plan for months, and when the day finally arrived, I was excited. I packed everything I thought I'd need: tent, sleeping bag, fire starter, food, water, a few tools, and the promise of solitude. The drive to the campsite was long, but it wasn't unpleasant. The road twisted through thick forest, narrowing as I climbed higher into the mountains. I passed only a few cars on the way. None seemed to be heading to the same place I was. The location was remote, tucked away deep within a national park. A place so far from civilization that you'd forget the world even existed outside of nature's reach. I arrived in the late afternoon. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting a golden glow over everything. There was a palpable stillness in the air, the kind that makes you pause and listen, like nature itself was holding its breath. As I got out of the car, the scent of pine and damp earth filled my lungs. It was the smell of peace, of the kind of silence you can only find in places untouched by human hands. Setting up camp wasn't difficult. The ground was firm but not rocky, and I found a decent spot near a small creek that flowed gently nearby. The sound of water trickling over smooth stones was soothing. I quickly set up the tent and got a fire going, then sat back to enjoy the serenity of the forest. The night was falling fast, and the fire's warm glow contrasted with the cooling air. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke to find the fire barely smoldering, and the night had fully settled in. The world outside the circle of light felt dense and almost oppressive. I added more wood to the fire and adjusted my position, wrapping myself in the warmth of the flickering flames. I had my backpack beside me, and I began to rummage through it, pulling out a flashlight to double-check that everything I needed was still there. That's when I heard it, a rustling sound coming from the trees just outside the reach of the firelight. It was subtle at first, just the slightest movement of branches, like a small animal pushing through the underbrush. But then it stopped, and for a moment, I convinced myself it was nothing more than a deer or maybe a raccoon, something that was part of the natural rhythm of the forest. But then it happened again. This time, the rustling was louder, more deliberate. I sat up straighter, my hand instinctively reaching for the small pocket knife at my belt. The forest was quiet again, too quiet, the kind of quiet that gnaws at you, the kind that makes you aware of every sound around you. I held my breath, waiting for something, anything, to break the stillness. Nothing. I pushed it out of my mind, telling myself it was just a wild animal, maybe a bird shifting in the branches above. I grabbed a few more logs and added them to the fire, trying to fill the space with light. But the rustling didn't stop. Came again, and this time it was closer. So close, I could almost feel the weight of something heavy moving in the shadows. I stood up slowly, my mind racing. There were no other campers in sight. I had passed a few parking spots on the way in, but the trailhead seemed far from here. I was alone. I stepped forward, into the darkness. My flashlight flicked on, casting a weak beam through the trees. The rustling stopped, but the silence was now charged with an unnatural tension. My heart thudded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure. It was just a glimpse, a shape moving between two large oaks. It wasn't an animal, not unless there were animals walking on two legs. I froze, the flashlight slipping from my fingers, the beam flashing wildly across the trees. The figure was gone before I could get a better look, leaving only the sound of my breath in my ears. My first instinct was to call out, to shout, but I didn't. I didn't want to seem like I was losing my composure. Instead, I crept back to the fire, keeping my eyes darting around the edge of the light. The shadows felt too alive, too full of possibility. The night dragged on, and I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire, occasionally adding wood, trying to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. My mind kept going back to the figure I'd seen. It wasn't enough to be sure of anything, but the way it moved, the speed, the way it vanished into the dark. There was something deeply unsettling about it. Hours passed. I checked the time on my phone. It was past midnight now. I didn't even realize how exhausted I was until my head started to nod off, and I jolted awake again. The fire had died down, leaving only a faint glow. The shadows had become even more oppressive, and the forest seemed to be holding its breath once more. Then came the sound, a soft thump like something hitting the ground. It was faint at first, but it repeated, closer this time. Then another thump, and another. I stood up, gripping the flashlight tightly. My heart raced in my chest as I scanned the darkness. It was coming from the creek. I took a few cautious steps in that direction, trying not to make a sound. The rustling grew louder, and I could hear the unmistakable sound of something moving in the water. The flashlight's beam barely reached the edge of the creek, but I could make out a shadowy figure near the bank. I stopped. The figure wasn't human. It was too tall, too wide. Its limbs were bent in ways they shouldn't have been, its body low to the ground. I didn't even think. I turned on my heel and ran. The sound of the thing, whatever it was, came after me, loud and frantic. My mind was a blur of panic, the sound of twigs snapping underfoot drowning out everything else. I didn't know where I was running, just away from that thing, away from the creek, away from whatever I had seen in the dark. I must have run for what felt like miles. My legs burned, and my breath came in sharp gasps, but I didn't stop. The woods around me were a maze, trees and rocks and brush twisting in ways I couldn't make sense of. The only thing that mattered was getting away. I stumbled into a clearing, the moonlight cutting through the trees, casting long shadows over the grass. I fell to my knees, gasping for air. My body was shaking, and I could feel the cold sweat trickling down my spine. But when I looked up, I saw it. The figure was standing at the edge of the clearing, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. It was tall, taller than any human, with long limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. It didn't move, didn't come closer. It just stood there, watching me. I didn't know what to do. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. For a long moment, we just stared at each other across the clearing. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and disappeared into the forest. I don't know how long I stayed in that clearing, staring into the dark. Could have been minutes, it could have been hours. The sound of the creek was distant now, and the rustling had stopped. The forest was quiet again. When I finally found the courage to move, I didn't go back to my camp. I didn't even look back. I just ran, blindly, until I found the road, and I didn't stop until I reached my car. I never went back to that campsite. I don't know what I saw, but I know what I felt. Whatever it was real, and I'll never forget the way the forest fell silent after it disappeared. I had never been one to shy away from the outdoors. Growing up in Vermont, camping was second nature to me. But this trip was different. I was alone, venturing into a remote part of the woods that I hadn't explored before. It wasn't a popular trail, and that was part of the appeal. The isolation, the quiet, it all seemed like the perfect way to clear my head. I had no idea just how wrong I was about the peacefulness I expected. It was late afternoon when I finally arrived at the campgrounds. The air was crisp, a sharp contrast to the humid summers of Vermont. The trees loomed above me, tall and thick with green, their leaves rustling gently in the breeze. It felt like the kind of place where the outside world couldn't touch you. That's what I thought, at least. I set up camp quickly, unloading my gear and setting up the tent. As I unpacked, I made sure to keep my food in a bear-safe container, something I had learned to do from years of camping. Bears weren't an issue in this part of the woods, or so I thought. The last thing I wanted was to attract one into my camp. Once everything was in place, I started a small fire and sat back on a log, taking in the surroundings. The fire crackled, sending small embers up into the air. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor. It was beautiful, but there was something about the silence that started to feel off. I couldn't put my finger on it. It was the kind of silence where even the birds seemed to have stopped chirping, as if they knew something I didn't. The wind, usually a constant presence in the trees, had slowed to a near standstill. It wasn't until I started to hear faint sounds that I realized how unnervingly quiet it had been. At first, it was just the sound of twigs snapping. It was a subtle noise, almost like something moving through the underbrush. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer, but my instincts were telling me otherwise. I shrugged it off, focusing on the fire. I had read that when you're in the woods, it's easy for your mind to start playing tricks on you, to turn innocent sounds into something sinister. Still, my mind kept returning to the noise. It was getting closer, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I stood up slowly, peering into the trees, but I saw nothing. The forest was still, the kind of stillness that seemed to stretch on forever. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I wasn't afraid of the woods. I had been camping for years, and I knew how to handle myself in situations like this. I told myself it was probably just a deer, or maybe even a raccoon. Animals in the wild don't care about humans, right? They keep to themselves. But then I heard it again. This time it was louder, a snap, followed by a soft rustling, like something was moving through the bushes just beyond my campfire's light. My heart skipped a beat. I grabbed a stick from the ground and held it close, just in case. The fire's glow was flickering now, casting weird, dancing shadows around me. I knew I was imagining things, but the noises continued. It wasn't just random animal sounds anymore. There was something deliberate about them, something that suggested they were being made by something that was paying attention to me. I wasn't alone. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that maybe I was just on edge from being in such an isolated place. I forced myself to sit back down on the log, but I couldn't relax. My mind kept racing. The noises came again. This time they were closer, too close. I could hear something moving through the underbrush, moving with purpose. And then the unmistakable sound of breathing, deep, heavy breaths. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. The breathing wasn't animal-like. It was too slow, too deliberate. It wasn't a bear or a deer. It was something else. I didn't know what, but it was out there. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't make myself move. The fire crackled, sending a fresh batch of sparks into the air, and for a moment, I thought I saw something shift in the darkness just beyond the light. I stood up quickly, clutching the stick tightly. The rustling stopped. For a moment, there was complete silence, and I felt a rush of relief. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me again. But then, I heard something that sent a jolt of fear through my body. A soft, faint whisper, as though someone was speaking just out of earshot. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a warning. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the trees, my breath coming in ragged gasps. There was nothing there, just the same thick darkness that enveloped everything beyond the reach of the firelight. I felt like I was going insane. I had to leave. I didn't care if it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I gathered my things as quickly as I could, shoving everything into my backpack. I didn't even care if I left my tent behind. I just had to get out of there. As I grabbed my backpack, I felt something wet drip onto the back of my neck. I froze again, slowly turning around. Nothing. But then I heard it, that deep, steady breathing again. This time it was directly behind me. It was so close that I could feel the air shift with each inhale. My body went rigid with fear. I wasn't imagining this. There was something there, something that was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I didn't wait for it to make the next move. I bolted. I ran blindly through the forest, my flashlight flickering in the chaos. The thick underbrush snagged at my legs, and I tripped several times, scrambling to get back on my feet. I had no idea where I was going, but I didn't care. All I could think about was putting as much distance between myself and whatever was back there. The forest felt like it was closing in around me. The trees were too thick, and the ground was uneven. My breathing was heavy, ragged. I could hear something following me, though I didn't dare to look back. Every time I thought I heard the sound of footsteps, I pushed myself harder, willing myself to run faster. I ran until my legs were aching, until my breath was coming in shallow gasps. But finally, I burst into a small clearing, and there, ahead of me, was the trail. The familiar, worn path that would lead me back to the campsite where other hikers had passed. I wasn't alone here. I was safe. I turned back, half expecting to see something lurking in the trees, but there was nothing. The forest was still once again, too still. I stood there for a moment, catching my breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was it a bear? Person? I didn't know, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I turned and ran down the trail, the sound of my footsteps ringing in the silence, and as I finally reached the parking lot, I could see the lights of my car. I wasn't going back into those woods. Not ever again. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, just a weekend getaway with some friends in the middle of nowhere. The kind of place where you could forget about the stress of everyday life, sit by the fire, and listen to the sound of nature all around. But it didn't take long for things to go wrong. I still remember the long drive to the campsite. We had set out early in the morning, the sun just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden light on the road. The air felt fresh, crisp, like the promise of adventure was just around the corner. My friends, Tom, Sarah, and Jack were all excited. They'd been talking about this trip for weeks, and now it was finally happening. We drove for hours, winding through narrow country roads that seemed to stretch on forever. The further we went, the more isolated everything seemed to become. The houses grew fewer and fewer, and soon, we were surrounded only by dense forests and rolling hills. There wasn't another car in sight, no signs of civilization at all. Eventually, we reached the campsite. It was a small, secluded area tucked away in the woods. There were no park rangers around, no signs of any other campers. Just us and the trees. We unloaded the gear, set up our tents, and started a fire. It felt like the perfect place to get away from everything. Too perfect, almost. That night, after a hearty meal, we sat around the fire, chatting and telling stories. The flames flickered, casting long shadows across the ground. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The forest seemed so alive, but in a strange, unsettling way. It wasn't long before the first odd thing happened. I had been staring into the fire, lost in my own thoughts, when I noticed something moving at the edge of the campsite. It was just outside the ring of light cast by the fire, too far away to make out clearly. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But then it moved again, and this time it was unmistakable. Something was out there watching us. I didn't say anything at first. I didn't want to look paranoid, so I just kept my eyes on the fire. But the longer I sat there, the more uneasy I felt. Every time I glanced towards the woods, I could swear I saw something shifting between the trees. It was as if the shadows themselves were moving, inching closer to the campsite. I told myself I was just imagining things. After all, we were in the woods. It was normal to feel a little nervous when surrounded by so much darkness. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It was like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. At one point, Tom suggested we play a game of cards, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting back to the strange shapes in the trees. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just the wind or an animal. But the more I ignored it, the worse it got. Eventually, Jack noticed I was acting off. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded, not wanting to admit what I was thinking. As the night dragged on, the unease only grew. The temperature dropped, and the wind picked up, rustling the leaves above us. We huddled closer to the fire, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the light, watching us. It was as if the woods themselves had come alive, and not in a good way. Around midnight, we decided to turn in for the night. I was the first to crawl into my tent. The others followed suit, each of us trying to shake off the tension that had settled over us. I zipped myself up in my sleeping bag and tried to sleep, but I couldn't. Every little sound in the night made my heart race. The wind howling through the trees, the distant call of an owl. It all felt too close, too personal. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke up to the sound of a twig snapping outside my tent. It was loud, like someone had stepped on it deliberately. My heart skipped a beat. I held my breath, straining to listen, but the night was silent again. Maybe it was just an animal. Maybe it was nothing. I lay there, my mind racing. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but the silence felt wrong. It was too still, too quiet. I was just about to drift back to sleep when I heard it again. A soft thud, followed by another. Someone or something was out there. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight from beside me and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. My eyes scanned the dark forest, but I saw nothing. The light from the campfire flickered in the distance, but there was no sign of anyone near the campsite. But something wasn't right. The air felt thick, charged, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to lie back down, but I couldn't. I kept hearing the noises, twigs snapping, branches shifting, the sound of something moving in the woods. I told myself it was probably just an animal, but it didn't feel like an animal. It felt deliberate, intentional. Then, I heard something I couldn't ignore, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slowly, they circled around the perimeter of the campsite, careful, measured. It was as if someone or something was testing the boundaries, making sure we were still in our tents. I wanted to call out to the others, but I couldn't bring myself to. I didn't know what to say. What if it was nothing? What if I was just overreacting? But the footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were right outside my tent. I froze. The air grew heavier, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. My hand tightened around the flashlight, my knuckles white with tension. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing but the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the footsteps stopped. The silence returned, heavy and suffocating. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the darkness outside, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, I drifted into a restless sleep, the events of the night swirling in my mind. The next morning, we woke up to find the campsite completely unchanged. No signs of anyone or anything nearby. The fire was out, the tents were intact, and the woods were as peaceful as ever. We tried to brush it off as a figment of our imagination, something we had all just been spooked by. After all, it was a dark, quiet night in the middle of the woods. Who wouldn't get a little jumpy? But as the day went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I couldn't get the image of those footsteps out of my head, or the sense of something watching us from the trees. The woods felt too close, too suffocating. I kept catching glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. We decided to pack up early, our weekend getaway turning into a rushed retreat. The drive back was uneventful, but the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had narrowly escaped something that wasn't quite right. I still think about that trip sometimes, especially when I'm out in the woods. I don't know what was out there that night, but I've never felt the same way about nature since. The woods have a way of hiding their secrets, and maybe it's better that way, because some things are better left undisturbed. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for months. I was finally getting away from the noise and chaos of everyday life to spend a few days alone in the woods. Just me, the trees, and the crackling campfire. The plan was simple: hike, fish, and enjoy the peace that only nature can provide. Little did I know, things weren't going to go quite as I expected. I set up camp in a secluded spot near a small lake, surrounded by thick woods. It was one of those hidden gems you read about in travel blogs, a place where few people go. That's exactly why I chose it. I wanted solitude, and the thought of having the entire area to myself felt perfect. By the time I finished setting up my tent and unpacking, the sun was starting to dip low in the sky. I made a small fire, cooked a simple meal, and sat back, watching the flames dance in the growing twilight. It was peaceful, too peaceful almost. As darkness fell, the forest around me came alive with sounds. The rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, and the occasional snap of a twig under some unseen creature's feet. But there was something else, something deeper in the woods. A low hum that seemed to vibrate in the air, just barely perceptible but persistent. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the fire instead. Could have been the wind or something else, I thought. Maybe a distant creak or animal. I settled into my sleeping bag later that night, the sounds of the forest all around me. But the hum was still there, growing a little louder, a little more insistent. It was hard to ignore. It wasn't natural, I was sure of that now. By midnight, I was wide awake, staring at the ceiling of my tent, the shadows of the trees shifting in the moonlight. I tried to convince myself that I was just imagining things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I had camped before a lot, but this felt different. It felt like I wasn't alone. The air was thick with humidity, and I could hear the occasional scuffle of small animals outside the tent. I told myself it was just raccoons or squirrels, but the sound seemed too deliberate, too close. My heart started racing. Was someone out there? I grabbed the flashlight from my pack and unzipped the tent cautiously. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees around me. Nothing. The campfire had long since died down, and the only sounds were the wind rustling the branches. Still, that feeling of being watched lingered. I decided to get some fresh air, hoping it would clear my head. The woods were eerily quiet, as if holding its breath, waiting for something. I walked away from the camp, trying to convince myself that I was being paranoid, but my senses were on edge. The hum had stopped, but the silence left a void that felt heavier than before. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the faintest sound reached my ears. It was the crunch of leaves, soft and careful, coming from somewhere behind me. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I spun around, but there was nothing. The trees stood still, their shadows stretching long in the moonlight, but nothing else stirred. I wasn't alone. I knew that now. I turned back to camp, my legs feeling heavier with every step. The sounds behind me grew louder, like footsteps following in sync with my own. I broke into a jog, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the edge of the clearing, I saw something, or rather, someone by my tent. A figure, tall, thin, and wrapped in dark clothing. They were just standing there, facing my tent. I froze again, paralyzed by fear. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it a fellow camper, or something worse? I didn't dare to move, not even a muscle. For what felt like an eternity, I just watched the figure, praying it would leave, hoping that it was just my imagination. But then, the figure started moving, walking slowly toward me, its head slightly tilted as if studying me. Panic surged through my veins. I turned and sprinted toward the campfire. I didn't care if it was dying out. I just needed the light, the safety. My feet pounded against the earth, and I didn't look back, not even once. I reached the fire pit, my hands shaking as I grabbed the nearest branch to poke at the embers, trying to get the fire going again. The The sound of footsteps was behind me now, closer. I could hear them crunching the leaves, slow and deliberate, as if the person, or whatever it was savoring the chase. My pulse hammered in my ears. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the fire caught again. A small flicker, then a blaze that lit up the area around me. I spun around, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but there was no one there. The footsteps had stopped. The figure was gone. I stood there, staring at the fire, my heart still racing. What the hell had just happened? Had I imagined it all? I waited for what felt like an eternity, but no other sounds broke the silence. I cautiously made my way back to the tent, keeping my flashlight on, scanning the area. My mind was still whirling, trying to find a logical explanation. The next morning, I packed up early. The sun was rising, and the woods seemed calm, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. There were no more footsteps, no more hum, just the normal sounds of the forest. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, something that had been watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down. I never found out who or what had been following me that night, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I packed my things in a hurry and left, my steps quick, my eyes darting around, scanning for anything out of place. The hum was gone, and so was the eerie feeling, but I couldn't forget it. I had learned a valuable lesson that night. Nature might be beautiful, but it has its own rules, its own dark side, and it's best to respect it from a distance. I drove back to civilization, my heart still heavy with unease, but with a sense of relief, knowing I had made it out. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. Who would believe me? But I knew one thing for sure. I would never go camping alone again. I had always loved the idea of camping. The freedom, the peace, the feeling of being close to nature. It was something I looked forward to every year. But this trip, the one I had been planning for months, was different. I had no idea how quickly things would take a turn for the worse. In fact, I would never have thought that something so terrifying could happen during a simple weekend camping trip. I had decided to go to Willow Creek. It wasn't too far from home, but far enough to feel like an escape. It was a place I had visited once when I was a kid, but I had never camped there. The area was known for its serene beauty, nestled deep in the forest with a quiet creek running through it, perfect for a weekend getaway. I drove up there alone, taking the winding road that led through towering pine trees. The scent of fresh pine filled the air as I arrived at the campsite, an isolated spot with a small clearing by the creek. There were no other campers around. It was a Friday afternoon, and the sun was just beginning to dip, casting an orange glow across the sky. The perfect setting, I thought. I had no idea it would be my last peaceful moment. I set up camp with ease. My tent went up quickly, the campfire pit was already dug, and I made sure I had everything I needed: water, food, a first aid kit, and of course, a flashlight. The forest was vast, and while the thought of being alone in it was a bit unnerving, I liked the isolation. It gave me the sense of being truly removed from the distractions of everyday life. As the evening wore on, the sun dipped lower behind the trees. I made myself dinner, listening to the sounds of nature, the crackle of the campfire, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the occasional chirp of a bird. But there was something strange about the quiet. It wasn't the usual calm of the wilderness I was used to. There was a heaviness to it, an eerie stillness that seemed to seep into the air around me. The sun finally set, and the darkness of the forest enveloped the campsite. The shadows stretched long and deep, and the flickering campfire was the only source of light. I tried to ignore the discomfort gnawing at the back of my mind, but no matter how much I tried to relax, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I wasn't sure if it was the isolation playing tricks on my mind or if something was really wrong. Every crackling branch in the distance felt like a footstep. Every rustle in the leaves sounded like something moving, something watching. At around midnight, I decided to go to bed. I crawled into my sleeping bag inside the tent, hoping sleep would bring some relief from the creeping unease. But sleep didn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined something lurking just beyond the glow of the campfire. Something waiting for me to slip up. I heard a sound outside the tent, faint but distinct, the crack of a twig breaking. I froze, my heart pounding. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was something else. I lay there listening. It was too quiet for an animal. If it were an animal, it would have made more noise, rustling through the underbrush, scrambling for food. But no, this was deliberate. It was slow, methodical, almost as if someone was sneaking around the camp, trying to remain unnoticed. I tried to convince myself that it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the hair on the back of my neck stood up. No animal moved like that. My mind raced, thinking through every possible scenario. Who would be out here? There were no other campers for miles, and I hadn't heard anything all day about people being in the area. The sound came again, closer this time. I held my breath, waiting. There was a long pause. Then, the unmistakable sound of someone breathing. I wasn't imagining it. It was right outside the tent, just on the other side of the thin fabric. My mind was racing, but I couldn't bring myself to make a sound. What if it was a person? What if it wasn't? The thought of someone out there watching me, waiting for me to make a move, made my blood run cold. The breath grew louder, deeper. I could hear it now, clear as day. I pressed my hand to my mouth, trying to stifle the panic rising in my chest. It was too much. I had to do something. I grabbed my flashlight, my fingers shaking as I flicked the switch, sending a beam of light into the dark. Nothing. The forest was empty. There was no one there. I sat there for a moment, bewildered, the flashlight in my hand trembling. I had to be imagining things. I must have been. It had to be the wind or some animal. I had to calm down. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. It had been months since I'd had a real break from work, and when the opportunity to go camping came up, I couldn't resist. I had a week off, and it seemed like the perfect way to unplug from everything and escape into the wild. I packed my gear, checked everything twice, and set off alone. The place I'd picked was a quiet, secluded spot deep in the forest, miles away from civilization, perfect for solitude. I had spent a lot of time hiking and camping in various places, but there was something different about this spot. The trees here were older, towering above me with thick trunks that seemed to have witnessed more years than I could fathom. The forest felt alive, but not in the way you'd expect. It wasn't the kind of place where birds sang merrily and animals frolicked in the open. No, this was a place of silence. Only the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional snap of a twig broke the stillness. I set up camp in a small clearing, just far enough from the river to avoid its cold rush, but close enough to enjoy the sound of it in the distance. It was late afternoon by the time I had everything settled. Tent pitched, firewood stacked, and the campfire ready to light. I was looking forward to a peaceful evening, cooking over the fire and watching the sunset paint the sky in fiery colors. I set up my small camp stove, made some coffee, and sat back to enjoy the quiet. The first night was peaceful enough. I couldn't remember the last time I had slept so soundly under the stars, with only the sound of the wind rustling the trees as a lullaby. But that feeling didn't last. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a strange noise. At first, I thought it was just the wind picking up, but then I heard it again. A soft scratching sound, like claws scraping across bark. It was faint, but it was unmistakable. I lay still in my sleeping bag, listening, trying to figure out what it was. The sound was coming from the direction of the trees, just beyond the camp. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel the presence of something out there, something watching. I forced myself to breathe calmly. Could have been a raccoon or a possum, right? But the noise didn't sound quite right. It wasn't the usual scurry of small animals. It was deliberate, slow, as if whatever it was had all the time in the world. My heart raced, and my mind began to wander. I tried to remind myself that I was being paranoid, that nature was just doing its thing. But something about the stillness, the deep quiet of the forest, set my nerves on edge. I decided to ignore it, hoping that whatever it was would just move along. But then I heard it again, closer this time, right at the edge of my camp. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My breath caught in my throat. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the flashlight and flicked it on, shining the beam into the darkness. There was nothing. The trees stood as still as ever, and the night was as silent as it had been before. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, but I couldn't bring myself to leave the safety of my tent. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a large deer or something, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The next morning, I went outside to find the camp in its usual state. Everything exactly where I'd left it. No signs of disturbance, no marks on the trees. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease that lingered, but it was hard to. The scratching noises had left a mark on me, and every creak of the trees or rustling of the leaves felt amplified in my mind. I decided to head out for a hike to distract myself. The forest was beautiful in the daylight, with sunlight streaming through the canopy and the sound of the river rushing nearby. But the deeper I went, the more I felt like something was off. The air grew colder, and the trees seemed to press closer together, blocking out the sunlight in places. The forest felt like it was holding its breath, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I pushed through, convincing myself that it was just my imagination running wild. I reached a small ridge that overlooked the valley, and for a moment, I forgot about the unease. The view was breathtaking. The rolling hills, the mist hanging over the river below, the jagged peaks in the distance. It was beautiful in a way that was almost surreal, like something out of a painting. But then I saw it, a figure moving between the trees far below. At first, I thought it was a person, maybe another hiker. But there was something off about the way it moved. It wasn't walking like a human, and it seemed to glide more than step. It disappeared behind the trees before I could get a better look. But the image lingered in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. I turned back toward camp, my mind racing. The hike didn't bring the sense of peace I had hoped for. I couldn't stop thinking about the figure I'd seen. When I returned to my campsite, it was already getting dark. I quickly started a fire and set up my tent, hoping the warmth would calm my nerves. But as the night deepened, the unease returned. The forest seemed alive in a way that felt wrong. There were no animals around, no sounds of the usual forest life, just the crackling of my fire and the rustling of leaves in the wind. Then, in the distance, I heard it again, the scratching sound. This time, it wasn't just a faint noise. It was louder, more deliberate. My heart skipped a beat. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it toward the trees, but again, there was nothing there. I spent the rest of the night lying awake, unable to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The scratching noises didn't stop. They came and went, like some animal was circling my camp, always just out of sight. I kept my flashlight on, my eyes scanning the shadows, but I didn't dare leave the safety of the tent. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to find it. The next morning, I was done. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, the sense of urgency pushing me to hurry. I didn't care about the wilderness or the adventure anymore. I just needed to get out of there. But as I packed up the last of my things, I noticed something strange. The ground around my tent was disturbed, like something heavy had been dragging along the earth. I bent down, trying to make sense of the marks, but the moment my hand touched the ground, I froze. There, in the dirt, were long, deep scratches, too large to be made by any animal I knew. Without thinking, I grabbed my pack and started running, heading back to the trail. I didn't look back, didn't care if I was leaving something behind. I just needed to get out of that forest. The further I went, the more the trees seemed to open up, and the air felt lighter, less oppressive. By the time I reached the main trailhead, the sun was high in the sky, and the forest seemed like a different place. Calm, peaceful even, but as I caught my breath and turned to look back at the dense woods, I could have sworn I saw movement again, just between the trees. I didn't stay long to find out. I've always enjoyed camping, the kind of camping where you get away from the noise of the world, sleep under the stars, and let the peace of nature wash over you. But that weekend, everything felt different. I'd gone to the same spot in the woods more times than I could count, a remote area near a small river, tucked between tall, thick trees. There's a comfort in returning to the same place over and over, but that night, something felt off. It was subtle at first, like a quiet whisper in the back of my mind, but as the night grew darker, the feeling grew stronger. I had set up my tent earlier that afternoon, right next to the river. The sun was still up, casting its last golden light over the water. I had a small campfire crackling nearby, the warmth chasing away the chill of the evening. I roasted marshmallows, had a cup of coffee, and sat back, letting the familiar sounds of the forest surround me. Birds were still singing their last songs before heading to their nests, and the river was babbling softly as it always did. But as the sky turned darker, I began to notice things. At first, it was just the rustling of leaves in the distance, the kind of sound that could easily be ignored, blamed on the wind or some small animal moving through the brush. But then I heard it again. Closer this time, a soft scraping sound, like something was moving through the undergrowth, just out of sight. I stood up, straining my eyes to see anything in the darkness, but the trees were thick, and the shadows played tricks on me. There was no wind to speak of, and the trees weren't swaying. I told myself it was nothing, probably just a deer or some raccoons. After all, I'd camped here dozens of times without any issues, but the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it only grew stronger as the night wore on. It was as if the forest itself had become aware of me, and I was no longer alone. I tried to shake off the unease, retreating into the comfort of my tent, but even there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just outside, watching. The night dragged on, and I tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. The sounds from outside were growing louder. Footsteps, the crackle of branches snapping underfoot. I grabbed my flashlight, flicking it on, half expecting to see someone standing just beyond the light's reach. But there was nothing, only the trees and the dark. Then came the sound that stopped my heart. A low growl, deep and guttural, like nothing I'd ever heard before. It wasn't a bear, not the kind of growl you'd expect. It was something different, more menacing, like an animal that shouldn't belong in these woods. My hand tightened around the flashlight, my breath shallow, as I tried to make sense of what was happening. The growl was followed by a strange, rhythmic scratching noise, like claws against bark or the side of my tent. I lay there, frozen, my mind racing. What was out there? What was it doing? My mind flashed through every horror story I'd ever heard about camping, but I refused to let it control me. I had to stay calm. I had to figure out what was going on. I waited, holding my breath, straining to hear any clue, any sound that might reveal what was lurking in the shadows. It was so quiet for a few moments that I started to doubt myself. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe it was nothing. But then the growl came again, closer this time. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my backpack and slipped out of the tent as quietly as I could. The night was cold now, the air sharp with the scent of pine and earth. My eyes adjusted to the dim light as I crept around the campfire, peering into the dark, scanning for any sign of movement. That's when I saw it. Not more than 10 feet from where I stood, something large and shadowy moved between the trees. It was too big to be a deer, too fast to be a bear. I watched in silence, my heart pounding, as it moved with unnatural precision, like it was following a path only it knew. The growl came again, this time closer and deeper, vibrating in my chest. I didn't think. I turned and ran. My feet were heavy, my breath short and panicked, but I couldn't stop. I had to get out of there. My mind screamed at me to get to the car, to drive as fast as I could away from whatever it was that was following me. I didn't dare look back, not once, afraid of what I might see. I must have run for miles, my legs burning, the darkness pressing in on all sides. Finally, I reached a clearing, the moonlight breaking through the trees just enough to see the road ahead. I stumbled toward it, my mind still racing, my heart beating so loudly in my chest that I thought everyone in the forest could hear it. As I reached the road, I looked over my shoulder. There was nothing, no shadow, no growl. The woods were silent, still, as if nothing had ever happened. I made it to my car and didn't stop driving until I was miles away, the forest a distant memory in my rearview mirror. I don't know what it was that followed me or what it wanted, but I do know that I'll never go back to that spot again. The woods are full of things we don't understand, things we can't see, and sometimes it's better to leave them undisturbed. I don't tell people what happened that night. Most wouldn't believe me anyway, but every time I hear the wind rustling through the trees, I remember the growl, the shadow, and the feeling that I was being hunted. And for the first time in my life, I'm okay with that. It was one of those weekends when everything seemed perfect. The kind of weekend you dream about when you're stuck in the middle of a busy work week, counting down the days to freedom. The air was crisp, and the forest felt inviting. Not too hot, not too cold, just right. I had been planning this camping trip for weeks. I needed a break, a chance to disconnect from the grind of everyday life and reset. I chose a quiet spot by a lake, a place that I'd visited years ago and remembered fondly. It was far enough from the usual trails that I knew I wouldn't run into too many people. I liked the solitude, the peace it brought. My backpack was packed, my gear was ready, and I had my favorite campfire food prepped. I was set. Driving to the site was easy. The road wound through thick trees and occasional open fields, and the sun filtering through the branches made the whole scene feel like it came from a painting. When I reached the campsite, I found it just how I remembered, empty, with only the soft lapping of the lake against the shore breaking the silence. I set up camp quickly, feeling the satisfaction that comes with creating your own little home away from home. Tent pitched, fire pit prepared, and the perfect spot by the water chosen for my chair. The first evening was beautiful. The sky was clear, and the sunset painted the clouds in shades of pink and purple. I sat by the fire, cooking my food, listening to the crackling wood and the occasional sounds of animals moving in the woods around me. I didn't think much about it, nothing out of the ordinary. Just a regular camping night, something I'd done dozens of times before. But something lingered at the back of my mind, a feeling I couldn't quite shake. The stillness of the night felt too perfect, almost unnerving, but I brushed it off, telling myself it was just the quiet of nature. After finishing my meal, I sat back in my camp chair, enjoying the night sky. The stars were more visible here than they had been in a while, like a blanket of tiny lights stretching endlessly above me. I knew the peacefulness wouldn't last long. I wasn't the only one out here. Animals, insects, and even the wind seemed to be aware of my presence, a reminder that this wasn't my world. It was theirs, but still it felt safe, felt like home. I don't know exactly when it started, but somewhere around midnight, I began to hear it, a rustling in the trees. I figured it was an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon looking for food. I didn't think much of it at first, but the rustling continued, growing more frequent, more deliberate. It was as if whatever was moving out there was circling the campsite. I kept my eyes on the trees, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever it was, but the darkness made it hard to see anything clearly. I decided to check my flashlight, shining it into the woods to see if I could spot anything. The light cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there, at least nothing I could see clearly. I told myself I was just being paranoid. Wild animals, after all, didn't care about humans. They went about their business, and I just happened to set up camp in their territory. But then it happened again, the rustling. This time it was closer, too close for comfort. My heart rate quickened, and I found myself listening harder, straining to hear. There were no more sounds of animals. No frogs croaking, no insects chirping, nothing. Just the rustling and the occasional snap of a branch. I stood up slowly, trying to make out the shapes around me. The fire was still burning, casting flickering shadows across the trees, but the darkness beyond the campfire's reach was oppressive, like something was hiding just out of sight. I grabbed my flashlight and turned it toward the edge of the woods where I had heard the noise coming from, but there was nothing. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the shadows they cast seemed to stretch toward me. I waited for a while, the uneasy feeling not fading. The rustling stopped, but the silence that followed felt heavy, almost too still. I sat back down, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. I wasn't new to camping. I knew how to handle myself in the wild, but the unease lingered. Couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the rustling again, closer this time and louder. My thoughts raced. Was someone out there? A hiker, maybe? It didn't make sense, though. No one else was supposed to be in the area, and no one had passed by earlier. The only thing I knew for sure was that the noise was unnerving, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I decided to check my gear, my tent, and my surroundings. The flashlight in my hand felt like a fragile thing, too small to make me feel safe, but I moved through the campsite cautiously. I double-checked the ropes of my tent, the zippers, and the straps on my backpack. Everything was in its place. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The air felt thicker now, almost suffocating. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly. The shadows grew longer, and the fire crackled in a way that seemed almost too loud for the quiet woods. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the tree line. I didn't know what I was looking for, but something inside me kept urging me to stay alert. Finally, the sounds stopped. The silence felt even heavier now, like the calm before a storm. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined something watching me from the trees. I could feel eyes on me, and every time the wind rustled the branches above me, my body tensed, expecting something to leap out of the darkness. The first light of dawn came as a relief. The sun broke over the horizon, casting a pale light on the camp and the surrounding trees. The forest no longer seemed oppressive. It was peaceful again. I checked my gear once more, packed up my things, and took one last look at the place where I had spent the night. There was nothing there. No sign of anything unusual, no tracks, no evidence that anyone or anything had been near my camp. But as I walked down the trail toward the parking lot, I noticed something strange. The ground was soft from recent rain, and there were footprints, human footprints, leading toward the lake where the trail split. They were large, barefoot, and looked fresh. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The prints led in the direction I had been sitting, right by the campfire, as if someone had been watching me the entire time I was there. I never found out who or what had been out there in the woods with me that night. The authorities couldn't find any trace of a person or any sign that anyone else had been in the area recently. But that experience left me with something I couldn't shake. I knew something had been out there, and it was no accident. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a deer, and it wasn't just my mind playing tricks. It was something real, and I didn't stick around to find out who or what it was. As I packed up the car and drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. The forest seemed so peaceful, so calm, but I knew better now. There was something in the woods that night, and it had been closer than I ever imagined. I never went back to that spot. I've since camped in other places, but every time I see a forest, I remember the feeling of being watched. And I can't help but wonder if that thing is still out there, waiting for the next person to set up camp in its territory. I had always been the type to seek adventure, even in the most remote places. That's why, when my friends and I decided to go camping in a less-known national park, I was all in. I've always loved the wilderness. Fresh air, silence, and the way the night sky opens up in ways you can never see in a city. But that trip would turn into something I never could have prepared for. The plan was simple: a weekend trip deep into the woods, away from the hustle of daily life. It was supposed to be just a few days of hiking, fishing, and setting up camp by a lake we'd heard about from some locals. There were no marked trails leading to the lake, so we figured we'd just wing it, make our own path, so to speak. It seemed like the perfect adventure. We arrived late in the afternoon, a little later than we'd planned, but we figured there was still enough daylight to set up camp. The drive had taken longer than expected, but the dirt road we followed was scenic, and the excitement of the trip kept our spirits high. The lake was nestled in a secluded valley, and the trees grew thick and dense around it. I remember thinking it looked almost untouched by human hands, just nature at its purest. But that should have been the first warning sign. We set up camp near the water's edge. The area was beautiful, with tall pines surrounding us, their needles rustling softly in the wind. The sun was dipping behind the mountains, casting a soft orange glow across the sky, and the water shimmered as the last light of day caught it. We made a campfire, and the crackling flames provided warmth as the temperature began to drop. We'd been looking forward to the evening, grilling some food, telling stories, and enjoying the peace of the wilderness. But that peace was about to be shattered. As the sun disappeared and the darkness fully settled, we sat around the fire, eating and talking. The sounds of the forest grew louder as night deepened. An owl's hoot in the distance, the occasional rustle of animals in the underbrush. We didn't think much of it, not at first. It was normal, or so we thought. There were moments when the fire seemed to flicker strangely, and the shadows would shift in ways that didn't seem quite right. But I brushed it off, thinking it was just the firelight playing tricks. We didn't notice anything odd at first. But then, as the night wore on, I started feeling uneasy. It wasn't just the usual creeping around in the dark kind of feeling. There was something more to it. Every now and then, I'd hear a slight rustling in the bushes, just beyond the firelight's reach. At first, I thought it was just the wind or a small animal, but the sound started to get closer. Every rustle, every snap of a twig, made my heart beat faster. I glanced around the camp, but no one else seemed to notice. They were too busy laughing or joking around, unaware of the subtle noises I was hearing. After a while, I decided to go for a short walk to stretch my legs. I told myself that I just needed to clear my mind. I grabbed my flashlight, clipped it to my belt, and started walking along the shoreline. The air felt colder now, and the trees loomed above me, casting long shadows that stretched unnervingly across the ground. The beam of my flashlight danced along the water, catching on the occasional ripple that the night wind caused. As I walked farther away from camp, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I turned around a few times, but there was nothing. Just the stillness of the night, the flickering of the campfire in the distance, and the feeling that something wasn't quite right. That's when I saw it. It was a figure standing motionless at the edge of the trees. My heart skipped a beat. It was human-shaped, but the details were hard to make out in the dim light. It was tall, and its silhouette was distorted by the shadows, making it seem almost unnaturally thin. For a long moment, I stood frozen, unsure of whether I should approach or turn back to the safety of the camp. But then, the figure took a step back into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there for a moment longer, my breath shallow, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it. After all, it was just a shadow. It was probably an animal, right? But as I stood there, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. Something was wrong. I rushed back to camp, not daring to look behind me. My mind raced, but I didn't say anything to the others. I just sat back down by the fire, trying to act casual. But I could see the unease in my own eyes. The others didn't notice, at least they didn't say anything. We sat there for a while longer, but the discomfort in my chest never went away. At some point, one of my friends suggested we turn in for the night. Everyone agreed, though I could tell they didn't feel quite as comfortable as they'd let on. We crawled into our tents, each of us trying to fall asleep despite the lingering tension. But sleep didn't come easily. I tossed and turned, listening to every little sound, wondering if I was just being paranoid. The next morning, I woke up early. The sun had just started to rise, casting a pale, golden light over the lake. The air was crisp, and the forest was quiet, almost too quiet. I stepped outside my tent to stretch, but something caught my eye near the edge of the camp. There, just beyond the trees, were fresh tracks in the soft earth. They were human-like footprints, large, deep, and disturbing. They were too big to be anyone in our group, and they were far too close to our campsite. My stomach twisted into knots as I examined them. They led toward the water and then stopped. No one else had seen them, and they couldn't have been there the night before. I wasn't sure what to make of them, but the thought that someone, or something, had been close to our camp was enough to send a cold shiver down my spine. We packed up as quickly as we could, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. The forest seemed to close in around us, and every snap of a twig, every rustling of leaves, made me jump. By the time we reached the car, I was exhausted, physically, emotionally, and mentally. It wasn't until I got home, safe and sound, that I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. But the experience stayed with me. The sound of those strange footsteps, the figure in the trees, the feeling of being watched. I can't explain it, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never look at the woods the same way again. In the end, we got away unharmed, but I'll never forget that feeling. The wilderness is vast, and sometimes it feels like it has secrets. Secrets it's not willing to share. And no matter how much I long for adventure, some places are better left unexplored. It had been a long week of work, and I was desperate to get away, so I decided to go camping. Not in some crowded, overly commercialized park, but deep in the woods, somewhere I could finally disconnect. I packed everything I needed: a tent, sleeping bag, food, a knife, and a small flashlight. I wanted nothing more than a peaceful, quiet weekend under the stars, far away from the constant noise of the city. I drove for hours, the road growing less familiar as I ventured deeper into the forest. The sun had already started to dip behind the mountains by the time I found a quiet spot next to a small creek. The sound of the water flowing over rocks was soothing, and the scent of pine filled the air. It was perfect. I set up camp quickly, my hands moving with practiced ease as I set up the tent, built a small fire, and unpacked my gear. As night fell, I sat by the fire, staring into the flickering flames. The light from the fire cast dancing shadows on the trees around me, and the night air was crisp. The forest seemed alive with sound: crickets, the rustle of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. But something else was there too, something I couldn't quite place. A feeling. It wasn't fear exactly, but a strange sense of unease that I couldn't shake. The sound of the creek was comforting, but every now and then, I thought I heard something moving in the woods behind me. A snap of a twig, a distant rustle of leaves. At first, I dismissed it as an animal, maybe a deer or something small scurrying through the underbrush. But the longer I sat there, the more certain I became that something was watching me. It wasn't a feeling of being observed by a friendly animal, but something much more deliberate. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks. But then I heard it again, a twig snapping, followed by a soft rustling sound. It was closer this time. My heart began to race. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag, shining it into the trees, but saw nothing. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear or a raccoon, both common in the area. I tried to calm my nerves by focusing on the fire, its warmth pushing back the chill in the air. But the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it seemed to grow stronger. Every time I moved, I could sense something shifting in the dark, watching from the trees just beyond the circle of light. I decided to turn in for the night, figuring I'd get some sleep and deal with whatever was in the morning. But as I lay in my sleeping bag, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The sound of the creek was still there, but now it seemed distant. I kept my flashlight nearby, its weak beam offering a small sense of security. The hours stretched on, and I must have drifted off at some point. But I was jerked awake by the sound of something moving near the edge of my campsite. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay perfectly still, straining to hear. The rustling was unmistakable. It was no animal. This was deliberate movement, like someone or something was circling my tent. I reached for the flashlight and shone it toward the noise, but there was nothing there. Only shadows and the flickering light of my fire, now reduced to little more than glowing embers. I was tense, my muscles aching from staying so still. It wasn't the cold that made me shiver. It was the strange feeling of being hunted, as if something was waiting for me to make a move, to slip up, to give it the chance to strike. I lay there for what felt like hours, the sounds of the forest surrounding me, but all I could focus on was the silence that had fallen in the moments after the noise stopped. No more rustling, no more twigs snapping, just the heavy, oppressive quiet that seemed to fill the air. When the first light of dawn finally filtered through the trees, I crawled out of my tent, my body stiff and sore from the restless night. The forest was calm again, and the sun was rising slowly, casting long shadows across the ground. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, eager to get out of that spot. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. I made my way back toward the road, but something about the forest seemed different now. The trees were taller, the shadows darker, and the path I'd followed in seemed unfamiliar, as though it had shifted in the night. By the time I reached my car, I was relieved, but I couldn't help but look back toward the woods. They stood there, silent and looming, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. But when I blinked, it was gone. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. No need to make myself sound paranoid. But as I drove back toward the city, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, watching me, waiting. The next day, I read about a missing hiker, a man who had gone camping in the same area I'd been in. Authorities said he'd disappeared without a trace, as though he had simply vanished from the earth. No one had found any sign of him, no clues, no tracks. It made my blood run cold. I couldn't help but wonder, Had whatever I'd felt that night been some sort of warning? Had I been lucky to leave when I did? I never went back to those woods. The weekend plan had been set for months. I'd been craving some solitude and decided to camp alone in the dense woods of the Kettle Creek region. It wasn't my first solo trip, and I liked the quiet. There was something soothing about being surrounded by nature with only my thoughts for company. I arrived early on Friday, wanting to make the most of the daylight. The dirt trail that led to my campsite was rough, winding through thick trees and patches of undergrowth. The leaves were beginning to turn shades of orange and red, a sign that autumn was settling in. I parked my car at the trailhead, double-checked my gear, and strapped on my backpack. My chosen site was about 4 miles in, close to a small creek. The hike there was uneventful, just the rhythmic crunch of my boots on the dirt path and the occasional rustle of wildlife in the bushes. By late afternoon, I reached the clearing. It was a beautiful spot, a flat patch surrounded by towering pines, with the creek bubbling softly just a few yards away. I set up my tent quickly, unpacked my supplies, and gathered some firewood. The sun was dipping lower, casting long shadows across the clearing, so I worked fast to get a fire going. The crackling flames brought warmth and light as the temperature started to drop. Dinner was simple, a freeze-dried meal rehydrated with boiling water. The smoky flavor of the campfire seemed to improve the taste. I sat there for a while, staring into the flames, listening to the natural symphony of the forest. Crickets chirping, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the gurgle of the creek. It was peaceful, the kind of peace you can't find in the city. As the fire burned down to embers, I crawled into my tent and zipped the flap shut. My sleeping bag was warm and cozy, and it didn't take long for me to drift off. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. It was pitch black, and the forest was eerily quiet. No wind, no crickets, nothing. That kind of silence always feels wrong, like the world is holding its breath. I lay there, straining my ears, trying to catch any sound. Then I heard it, a faint crunching noise, like footsteps on dry leaves. My pulse quickened. Could have been an animal, a deer maybe, but it sounded deliberate, like something or someone walking. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent slowly, and shone the beam outside. The clearing looked just as it had when I'd gone to sleep. My fire pit was cold, the trees were still, and there was nothing unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I sat there for a while, scanning the area with my light, but eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe a branch had fallen, or some nocturnal critter had passed by. I crawled back into my sleeping bag, but sleep didn't come easily. Every little sound, a twig snapping, a distant rustle, kept me on edge. Eventually, exhaustion won and I dozed off. The next morning, I woke up early. The uneasiness from the night before still lingered, but the daylight made it easier to dismiss. I cooked a quick breakfast, packed a day bag, and decided to explore the area. There were several trails nearby, and I'd marked a few points of interest on my map. Hiking always helped clear my head. The first few hours were great. The trails were well marked, and the scenery was stunning. I found a small waterfall, snapped some photos, and even spotted a couple of deer grazing in a meadow. But as the afternoon wore on, I started to notice something odd. Every now and then, I'd get the sense that I wasn't alone. It's hard to describe. A prickling on the back of my neck, the feeling of eyes on me. I'd stop and look around, but there was never anything there, just trees and shadows. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps behind me. I stopped abruptly and turned, but the trail was empty. The only sound was the wind rustling through the leaves. Still, the sensation was hard to ignore. By the time I made it back to my campsite, the sun was already sinking toward the horizon. I felt relieved to be back, but the uneasy feeling hadn't left me. That night, I built a bigger fire, hoping the light and warmth would keep whatever was out there at bay. I ate my dinner quickly, my ears tuned to every sound in the forest. Once again, the night was unnervingly quiet. I decided to stay up for a while, keeping the fire going as long as I could. Around midnight, I thought I saw movement at the edge of the clearing. It was quick, just a shadow darting between the trees. My heart raced as I grabbed my flashlight and shone it in the direction, but there was nothing there. I sat there, gripping the light tightly, my mind racing. Was it an animal? Person? The idea of someone lurking out there, watching me, sent a chill down my spine. I decided to keep my gear ready, just in case. My backpack was packed with essentials, and I had a small hunting knife within arm's reach. The hours dragged on. Eventually, the fire died down again, and I couldn't stay awake any longer. I crawled into my tent, clutching the knife, and tried to sleep. But just like the night before, I woke up in the middle of the night. This time, there was no mistaking it. The sound of footsteps was louder, closer. They weren't coming from the trees, but from within the clearing. My heart pounded as I lay there, frozen. Then, the sound stopped, right outside my tent. I held my breath, listening. The zipper of my tent suddenly rattled, like someone was testing it. Pure panic surged through me. I didn't know what to do. If it was a person, what did they want? If it wasn't... No, I couldn't let my mind go there. I gripped my knife tightly, ready to defend myself. But after what felt like an eternity, the rattling stopped. The footsteps retreated, growing fainter until they disappeared altogether. I stayed awake the rest of the night, knife in hand, flashlight ready. When dawn finally broke, I emerged from the tent cautiously. The clearing looked normal, but I noticed something that hadn't been there before. Footprints. They were large, unmistakably human, and they circled my tent several times. My stomach churned. Whoever it was had been watching me, maybe even waiting for me to come out. I decided I'd had enough. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The hike back to the car felt endless. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves set me on edge. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following me, but the trail remained empty. When I finally reached the parking lot, I practically ran to my car. Throwing my gear into the back seat, I jumped in and locked the doors. Only when I was driving down the dirt road did I start to feel a sense of relief. But even then, the questions lingered. Who had been out there? What did they want? And why didn't they do anything? That trip left a mark on me. I still camp, but never alone anymore. The woods can be beautiful, but they're also unpredictable. You never really know who or what might be out there watching from the shadows. I had planned this trip for months, a solo camping journey deep into the Adirondack Mountains. It was something I had always wanted to do. Get away from the noise of the city, disconnect, and immerse myself in nature. The timing seemed perfect. The weather forecast was favorable, and my work obligations were light. I packed my gear meticulously. A sturdy tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, a reliable water filter, and a first aid kit. I even double-checked my map and GPS, though I told myself I wouldn't rely on technology too much. I wanted to navigate the old-fashioned way with a compass and a map. The drive to the trailhead was peaceful. Rolling hills and dense forests lined the winding roads. The air smelled crisp, and I felt a surge of excitement as I pulled into the nearly empty parking lot. There were only 2 other cars, their owners already out on their own adventures. Shouldering my pack, I set off on the trail, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots the only sound for miles. The first day was uneventful in the best way. The trail wound through thick woods, occasionally opening up to reveal stunning views of distant peaks. I stopped at a stream to refill my water bottle, savoring the icy coldness. By late afternoon, I found a clearing that seemed perfect for setting up camp. The ground was level, and there was a fallen log nearby that would serve as a makeshift bench. I pitched my tent, gathered some wood for a small fire, and cooked a simple meal of dehydrated chili. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest came alive with the sounds of crickets and distant owls. I felt a profound sense of contentment as I crawled into my sleeping bag and drifted off to sleep. The second day started smoothly. After a quick breakfast, I broke camp and continued along the trail. My goal was to reach a remote lake about 10 miles in. The trail became more challenging as I went deeper into the wilderness. Rocks and roots jutted out, and sections of the path were overgrown, but I relished the challenge. Around midday, I paused to eat and consult my map. According to the contours, the lake was only a couple of miles away. I pushed on, eager to reach my destination. It was mid-afternoon when I arrived at the lake. The water was as still as glass, reflecting the surrounding trees and sky like a mirror. I felt a sense of triumph. This was the kind of solitude I'd been craving. I spent the rest of the day exploring the area, fishing with a small collapsible rod I'd brought, and just sitting by the water, letting my mind wander. By evening, I had set up my second camp. The fire crackled softly as I ate and watched the stars appear one by one. It felt like I was the only person in the world, but the serenity didn't last. That night, I woke up abruptly. At first, I wasn't sure what had stirred me. I lay still, listening. The forest was quiet, almost unnaturally so. The usual hum of insects and distant animal calls was absent. A faint rustling sound came from outside my tent. My heart started to race. Could be a deer, I told myself, or maybe a raccoon scavenging for scraps. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, as the rustling grew louder, then stopped altogether. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing and forced myself back to sleep. The next morning, I found tracks near my tent. They weren't animal tracks. They were boot prints. My stomach sank as I studied them. They circled my tent, then veered off into the woods. I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail, and this area was so remote that encountering another person seemed unlikely. I tried to brush it off. Maybe someone had passed by, curious about my camp. Still, the thought unsettled me. I decided to move on and put some distance between me and whoever might be out here. The trail became increasingly difficult to follow as I ventured deeper into the wilderness. Sections were overgrown and markers were scarce. Around midday, I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in over an hour. Panic began to creep in. I pulled out my map and compass, trying to pinpoint my location. It didn't add up. The terrain around me didn't match what was on the map. I decided to backtrack, hoping to find the trail again. That's when I noticed it. The boot prints were back. Faint, but unmistakable. They were following me. My mind raced. Was it the same person who had been near my tent? Were they deliberately stalking me? Or was it just a coincidence? I quickened my pace, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The forest, once a place of peace, now felt oppressive. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, set my nerves on edge. By late afternoon, I found a small stream and decided to follow it. Streams often lead to larger bodies of water or trails, I reasoned. The going was tough, but at least it felt like progress. The sun was setting when I stumbled upon a dilapidated cabin. It looked abandoned, the roof sagging and the windows shattered. But it was shelter and I needed to regroup. Inside, the air was musty and the floor was littered with debris. An old table and chair stood in one corner, and there was a rusted wood stove. I barred the door with a broken plank and set up my sleeping bag in the corner farthest from the windows. I didn't dare light a fire, not wanting to draw attention. As darkness fell, I sat in the gloom, clutching my knife, every sound amplified in the silence. The night was interminable. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, but they faded quickly. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn, then packed up and left the cabin as quickly as possible. My only goal was to get out of the woods. The stream eventually led me to a larger river, and to my immense relief, I found a trail running alongside it. Exhausted but determined, I followed it. Hours passed, and just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I heard voices. Rounding a bend, I saw a group of hikers. Relief flooded over me as I approached them. They were startled by my appearance, disheveled, dirty, and clearly shaken, but they were kind. They shared water and snacks and confirmed that we were only a few miles from the nearest trailhead. When I finally reached the parking lot, my car was a welcome sight. I threw my pack in the back, got in, and locked the doors. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even now, weeks later, I can't explain what happened out there. I've replayed the events in my mind countless times. Was it just paranoia? Or was someone truly following me? I may never know, but one thing is certain. I'll think twice before venturing into the wilderness alone again. It started as a simple idea. Take a few days off from work and head into the mountains for some solitude. I'd always loved camping, and with the stress piling up lately, it seemed like the perfect escape. I chose a spot deep in the woods, far from the crowded campgrounds and touristy trails. It was a place I'd read about online, a valley surrounded by dense forests with a river cutting through it. Remote, quiet, and untouched. I packed light but made sure to bring everything essential. A sturdy tent, enough food for 3 days, a map, compass, and my trusty knife. I even threw in a small emergency kit just in case. By the time I reached the trailhead, it was late morning. The sky was clear, the air crisp, and the faint smell of pine lingered as I started the hike. The trail was rough, barely visible in some places, but I liked it that way. It felt like I was leaving the world behind with every step. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the occasional rustle of leaves when a bird or squirrel darted through the undergrowth. After about 5 hours of hiking, I reached the valley. It was everything I'd hoped for, isolated and serene. The river flowed gently, its water sparkling under the afternoon sun, and the tall trees provided plenty of shade. I found a flat spot near the river to set up my camp. By the time the tent was up and my small fire was crackling, the sun was dipping low on the horizon. I cooked a simple meal and sat by the fire, enjoying the quiet. It was the kind of peace I'd been craving for weeks. As night fell, the temperature dropped quickly. I added more wood to the fire and wrapped myself in my jacket. The stars above were breathtaking, scattered across the sky like a million tiny lights. I stayed up for a while, just staring at them, before retreating to my tent. The first night was uneventful. I slept deeply, waking only once to the distant howl of a coyote. It was far away, nothing to worry about. Morning came with the soft glow of sunlight filtering through the trees. I made coffee on my portable stove and spent the day exploring the area. The forest was dense, the trees towering above me, their branches intertwining to create a canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. The river was cold and clear, and I spent a good hour just sitting by its edge, letting the sound of the flowing water wash over me. As the sun began to set on the second day, I felt a slight unease. It was subtle, just a nagging feeling at the back of my mind. I brushed it off as my imagination. Being alone in the wilderness can play tricks on you. I'd read enough about that, how the isolation and silence can make you feel like you're being watched. Still, I couldn't shake it completely. That night, I made sure to keep my knife within reach as I crawled into my sleeping bag. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. The fire had burned down to embers, and the forest was pitch black. Something had snapped a branch nearby. It wasn't a small sound, not the kind a raccoon or squirrel would make. This was heavier, deliberate. I lay still, my heart pounding in my chest, straining to hear any other noise. The seconds stretched into minutes, and just when I thought I might have imagined it, there was another sound. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and too heavy to belong to an animal. I sat up quietly, reaching for my knife. My breath was shallow, my ears straining to locate the source of the noise. The footsteps seemed to circle my camp, staying just beyond the glow of the dying fire. Whoever or whatever it was, they were careful, deliberate. I didn't dare call out. The stories I'd read about campers encountering strangers in the woods flashed through my mind. Most of them didn't end well. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps stopped. I waited, knife in hand, until the first light of dawn began to creep through the trees. Only then did I crawl out of the tent. The campsite looked untouched, but I noticed faint impressions in the dirt. Footprints. Human footprints. They led away from my camp, disappearing into the forest. My first instinct was to pack up and leave immediately, but something about the footprints bothered me. They were barefoot. Despite my unease, I convinced myself to stay. I'd come here to escape, to find peace, and I wasn't about to let my imagination ruin it. I spent the day gathering firewood and exploring further upriver, trying to shake the fear from the night before. By the time evening came, I felt more at ease. I told myself it was probably just another camper who'd wandered too close. Maybe they'd seen my fire and decided to keep their distance. It wasn't a comforting thought, but it was better than the alternatives my mind had conjured. That night, I built the fire bigger and kept it burning longer. I stayed up late, listening to the forest, every crackle of the fire and rustle of leaves putting me on edge. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off to sleep. But it didn't last long. I woke to the sound of movement again. This time it was closer. My fire had burned low, but there was enough light to see the silhouette of a figure standing just beyond the edge of the camp. They were motionless, staring at the tent. I froze, my mind racing. I gripped the knife tightly, unsure of what to do. My thoughts spiraled. Was it the same person as the night before? Were they alone? What did they want? I stayed as still as possible, watching the figure. They didn't move for what felt like hours, just stood there, barely illuminated by the glow of the embers. Then, without a sound, they turned and walked into the forest. I waited until the first light of dawn before stepping outside. The footprints were back, circling my camp this time, and leading off into the woods in multiple directions. Whoever it was, they'd been here for a while. That was enough for me. I packed up my gear in record time and started the hike back to the trailhead. Every step felt heavy, my senses heightened, every sound in the forest making my heart race. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. The trail, which had seemed so peaceful just days before, now felt oppressive. The trees felt closer, the shadows darker. After hours of hiking, I reached the trailhead. My car was still there, untouched. Relief washed over me as I threw my gear into the trunk and climbed into the driver's seat. As I started the engine and pulled onto the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Even as the forest faded in my rearview mirror, the unease lingered. It wasn't until I was miles away, back in the safety of civilization, that I allowed myself to relax. I've thought about that trip often since then, replaying every detail in my mind. I don't know who was out there or what their intentions were, but I've never gone camping alone again. The wilderness, once a place of peace and solitude for me, now feels like a reminder of how vulnerable we are out there, alone with nothing but the trees and whatever or whoever might be watching. I've always loved the outdoors. There's something about the stillness of nature that feels so distant from the chaos of everyday life. So, when I had a long weekend coming up, I decided to head out for a solo camping trip. I had done it before and it's never been an issue. I'm careful, prepared, and used to being alone. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat. Just me, my gear, and the forest. I chose a spot in a national forest about 3 hours from where I live. It wasn't a marked campground, but that's part of what I liked about it. I found the location years ago and had visited a few times before. It was off a dirt road that branched off the main highway, tucked away near a small river. The place felt remote but not entirely cut off. There was no cell service, but I'd left my itinerary with a friend in case anything went wrong. I packed light but smart. A good tent, a sleeping bag rated for the season, plenty of food, water, and a first aid kit. I even brought a portable weather radio just in case. The forecast was clear, and the autumn air was crisp but not too cold. Perfect camping weather. The drive out was uneventful. The last stretch of the road was bumpy, but my truck handled it fine. I reached the spot around mid-afternoon and set up my tent near the river. The sound of the water rushing over rocks was calming, a natural white noise that I knew would help me sleep. I gathered some firewood, set up a small fire pit, and cooked an early dinner as the sun began to set. By nightfall, the forest was pitch black. The only light came from my fire and the faint glow of the stars above. I sat by the fire, sipping coffee from my thermos and listening to the sounds of the woods. Crickets chirped, leaves rustled in the breeze, and occasionally, I'd hear the distant hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, exactly what I had come for. The first night passed without incident. I woke up with the sun, feeling refreshed. After a quick breakfast, I decided to explore the area. I followed the river upstream, enjoying the solitude. The forest was alive with color. The trees were dressed in shades of red, orange, and yellow. I stopped occasionally to take pictures, but mostly I just walked, letting my mind wander. By the time I returned to camp, it was mid-afternoon. I spent the rest of the day relaxing, reading a book I'd brought, and preparing for another night under the stars. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I built another fire and cooked dinner. The routine felt familiar, comforting. But that second night felt different. It started with a sound. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. It was faint, barely audible over the crackling of the fire. A rustling in the bushes, maybe 20 or 30 feet away. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the area, but the beam revealed nothing unusual. Just trees and shadows. I tried to shake it off. It wasn't uncommon to hear animals moving around at night, especially in a place like this. Still, I couldn't help but feel uneasy. I double-checked that my food was secured in the truck to avoid attracting bears and added more wood to the fire. The flames grew brighter, pushing back the darkness. The rustling stopped, and for a while, everything seemed normal again. I convinced myself I was being paranoid and eventually climbed into my tent to sleep. The sound of the river and the lingering warmth from the fire lulled me into a light sleep. I woke up suddenly. It was the kind of awakening where you're instantly alert, every sense on high alert. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow. The air felt colder, heavier, and then I heard it again, that rustling noise. Only this time it was closer. I stayed still, straining to hear. The rustling turned into deliberate steps, crunching leaves and snapping twigs. Someone, or something, was walking around my campsite. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for my flashlight. Slowly, I unzipped the tent and peeked out. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but I didn't see anything. The sound stopped as soon as I moved. The forest was silent again, unnervingly so. I stepped out of the tent, flashlight in one hand and a camping knife in the other. I scanned the area, my breath visible in the chilly air. Nothing. No movement, no sound. Just the faint glow of the dying fire and the dark silhouettes of trees. I told myself it was probably an animal. A curious raccoon or a fox, maybe even a deer. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I added more wood to the fire, hoping the light would deter whatever was out there. Then I sat by the flames, knife in hand, and waited. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I didn't sleep much. Every little noise put me on edge. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted but relieved. I told myself I was overreacting, that my imagination had gotten the better of me. Still, I couldn't ignore the unease that lingered. I decided to stay one more night, mostly out of stubbornness. I'd come here to relax, and I wasn't going to let a couple of unsettling noises ruin my trip. During the day, I stayed close to camp, gathering more firewood and keeping myself busy. I tried to shake off the previous night's events, but the unease never fully went away. That evening, I built the biggest fire yet, determined to keep the campsite well lit. As the sun set, I felt a growing sense of dread. The forest seemed quieter than before, the usual sounds of wildlife replaced by an oppressive silence. Even the river seemed muted. I sat by the fire, forcing myself to eat dinner even though I had no appetite. I kept the flashlight and knife within arm's reach, my eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. Hours passed, and nothing happened. The fire crackled, the river flowed, and the stars shone above. Slowly, I began to relax, convincing myself that the previous night had been a fluke. And then I heard it again. This time, there was no mistaking it. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and unmistakably human. They came from the direction of the river, moving closer with each step. My stomach dropped as I realized whoever it was had been watching me, waiting for the right moment. I grabbed my flashlight and knife, standing up and facing the direction of the sound. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice steady despite the fear gripping me. No response. The footsteps stopped, and the silence was deafening. I shone the flashlight into the trees, the beam darting back and forth. Nothing. No movement, no shadow, nothing to explain the sound. But I knew someone was out there. I could feel their presence, watching me from the darkness. I backed toward the fire, the knife clutched tightly in my hand. My mind raced as I considered my options. I could stay by the fire, hoping the light would keep them away, or I could make a run for my truck. The vehicle was parked about 50 yards away, not far, but far enough to feel like an eternity in the dark. Before I could decide, I heard a sudden crash behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but saw nothing but trees and shadows. It was a diversion, I realized. Whoever was out there was trying to scare me, to make me panic. I'd had enough. I grabbed my backpack, which I had kept packed for emergencies, and bolted for the truck. My flashlight bobbed wildly as I ran, the beam barely illuminating the uneven ground. Every step felt like a gamble, my ears straining for any sound of pursuit. I reached the truck, yanked open the door, and threw my backpack inside. The keys were in my pocket, and my hands trembled as I fumbled to unlock the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I didn't waste a second. I threw the truck into gear and sped down the dirt road, my tires kicking up dust and gravel. As I drove, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone chasing me. But there was nothing, just the empty road and the dark forest fading into the distance. It wasn't until I reached the main highway that I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. I never found out who or what was out there that night, Part of me wants to believe it was just my imagination, but deep down, I know better. Someone was watching me, stalking me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I've thought about it a lot since then, replaying every detail in my mind. The rustling, the footsteps, the oppressive silence. It all felt too real to dismiss. I haven't been camping since. The thought of being alone in the woods, vulnerable and exposed, is too much to bear. I still love the outdoors, but now I stick to day hikes and well-traveled trails. The forest no longer feels like a refuge. Instead, it's a reminder of how quickly peace can turn to terror. The air smelled of pine and damp earth as I pulled into the small gravel lot. This wasn't a well-known campground, just a spot I had heard about from a coworker who swore it was the perfect getaway. It was mid-October, and I had planned this solo camping trip as a way to clear my head. Work had been relentless, and I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of deadlines and endless meetings. A weekend in the woods, away from cell service and the constant pinging of notifications, seemed like exactly what I needed. The trailhead was marked by a faded wooden sign, the paint peeling to reveal weathered wood underneath. It read, Red Hollow Trail, and below it, in smaller letters, 6.2 miles to Overlook Campsite. I slung my pack over my shoulders, feeling the familiar weight settle against my back. It wasn't my first time camping alone, but something about this trip felt different. Maybe it was the isolation or the fact that I hadn't told anyone exactly where I was going. That was part of the appeal, though. No one could reach me, no one could bother me, just me and the woods. The trail started gently enough, winding through tall pines and occasional bursts of bright yellow aspen leaves. The crunch of leaves underfoot was oddly satisfying, and for the first couple of miles, I felt the tension in my shoulders begin to ease. The sun filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows on the ground. It was quiet, apart from the occasional rustle of a squirrel or the distant call of a bird. Peaceful, exactly what I had been craving. Around mile 4, the trail began to climb. The incline wasn't steep, but it was steady, and I could feel the burn in my legs as I pushed forward. The air grew cooler as I gained elevation, and I stopped to pull on a fleece. The forest here was denser, the trees packed closer together. The undergrowth was thick, and I noticed that the usual forest sounds had faded. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my boots crunching against the dirt path. I told myself it was normal. Higher altitudes meant fewer animals. Still, the silence felt heavy. By the time I reached the campsite, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. The Overlook Campsite was exactly what the name suggested. A small clearing perched on the edge of a steep drop, offering a breathtaking view of the valley below. I could see for miles, the trees stretching out like a sea of green and gold. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, the kind of sunset that makes you feel small in the best possible way. I set up my tent quickly, my movements practiced and efficient. By the time darkness fully settled in, I had a small fire crackling in the fire ring. I sat close to it, the warmth chasing away the chill of the evening. Dinner was a simple affair, a freeze-dried meal rehydrated with boiling water. Not gourmet by any means, but it hit the spot. As I ate, I stared out into the darkness, the valley below now shrouded in shadow. The stars were brilliant, a dazzling array of light against the inky black sky. The isolation felt different at night. During the day, it had been a relief, a break from the constant noise of modern life. But now, sitting alone in the dark with nothing but the crackling of the fire for company, it felt heavier, oppressive. I brushed the feeling off. I had camped alone plenty of times before, and this was no different. I told myself to enjoy it. How many people got to experience this kind of solitude? I went to bed early, the long hike and fresh air leaving me pleasantly exhausted. My sleeping bag was warm and comfortable, and I drifted off to the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Sometime in the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had pulled me from my sleep. The tent was pitch black, and I could hear the wind still whispering through the forest. But there was something else, a sound I couldn't quite place. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A soft, rhythmic tapping. I held my breath, straining to hear. Tap, tap, tap. It sounded like it was coming from outside the tent, near the edge of the clearing. I told myself it was nothing. A branch swaying in the wind, maybe, or an animal. The woods were full of animals, after all. I forced myself to relax, to close my eyes and let sleep take me again. It took a while, but eventually I drifted off. The next morning, the tapping was all but forgotten. The sun was shining, and the view from the overlook was even more stunning in the daylight. I made myself a quick breakfast and decided to explore the area a bit before heading back down the trail. There was a smaller, unmarked path leading away from the campsite, and curiosity got the better of me. I followed it for about half a mile, the trees closing in around me. The path was narrow, barely more than a game trail, and I had to duck under low-hanging branches as I went. Eventually, the trail opened up into another clearing. This one was smaller than the campsite and less inviting. The grass was overgrown, and there were no signs of recent human activity. In the center of the clearing stood an old wooden structure. It looked like a cabin, but it was in bad shape. The roof was sagging, and the walls were covered in moss and vines. It didn't look safe, but curiosity got the better of me. I approached cautiously, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. The door was hanging off its hinges, and the interior was dark and musty. I stepped inside, my boots crunching on a layer of debris that covered the floor. The cabin was empty, save for a few rusted tools and a broken chair. It didn't look like anyone had been here in years. Still, the place gave me an uneasy feeling. The air felt heavier inside, and I had the distinct sensation of being watched. I didn't stay long. Back at the campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I packed up my gear quickly, deciding to cut my trip short. The hike back to the trailhead was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I never saw or heard anything, but the sensation was there, prickling at the edge of my awareness. When I finally reached my car, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. It wasn't until I was back home, unpacking my gear, that I noticed something strange. My tent, which I had carefully packed that morning, had a long, thin slash down one side. It hadn't been there before. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Had I snagged it on a branch without noticing? But the cut was clean, too clean to have been made by accident. To this day, I don't know what happened out there. I've replayed the trip in my mind countless times, trying to make sense of it. I've told myself it was just my imagination, that the isolation was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in those woods. It all started when I decided to take a solo camping trip deep into the forest. I'd been feeling restless for weeks, stuck in the monotony of everyday life. Work was dragging me down, and I needed a break from screens, meetings, and city noise. The idea of spending a few days completely disconnected sounded like exactly what I needed. I picked a national forest about 3 hours from where I lived, a place I'd visited a few times but never explored deeply. I planned everything meticulously. I packed my gear, a reliable tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, a small stove, extra clothes, and basic first aid supplies. I even brought a map and compass, though I had a GPS device as well. My car was stocked with an emergency kit, just in case. I felt prepared, confident that I could handle whatever came my way. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful, though the last stretch of the road was rough, full of potholes and barely wide enough for one car. When I finally parked, I noticed mine was the only vehicle there. It wasn't surprising. It was midweek, and this wasn't a popular trail. That was part of the appeal. I shouldered my pack, locked the car, and started hiking. The first day was beautiful. The trail wound through dense trees, and the air was cool and fresh. I walked for hours, crossing small streams and stopping occasionally to take in the scenery. By mid-afternoon, I reached a clearing by a river that seemed like a perfect spot to set up camp. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and cooked a simple meal. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. The only sounds were the gurgling river and the occasional rustle of leaves. That night, I slept well. The forest was alive with noise, crickets, frogs, the distant call of an owl, but it was comforting. I woke up at dawn, feeling refreshed and ready to explore. After a quick breakfast, I packed a day bag with water and snacks and set off to follow a faint trail that seemed to lead deeper into the woods. It wasn't marked on my map, but I figured I'd stay out for a few hours and return well before dark. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The usual forest sounds faded until the only thing I could hear was my own footsteps. The trail grew narrower, eventually disappearing altogether, but I kept going, feeling adventurous. The terrain became rougher with steep inclines and thick undergrowth. I was careful to note landmarks so I wouldn't get lost. A fallen tree shaped like an arch, a cluster of white boulders, a patch of bright orange mushrooms. I wasn't worried. I had my GPS and a good sense of direction. Around midday, I reached a small, secluded valley. It was stunning, a hidden gem surrounded by towering cliffs and dotted with wildflowers. I sat on a rock to eat my lunch, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. But as I sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was too quiet. Not a single bird chirped. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, but I told myself it was just my imagination. I decided to head back, retracing my steps carefully. But after walking for about an hour, I realized something was wrong. None of the landmarks I'd noted earlier were in sight. I checked my GPS, but the screen was blank. The battery had died, which was strange because I'd fully charged it the night before. I pulled out my map and compass, trying to get my bearings, but the dense forest made it hard to find any clear points of reference. Panic started to creep in, but I forced myself to stay calm. I knew the general direction of my campsite and started walking that way. The light began to fade, and the forest took on a menacing quality. Shadows stretched long and dark, and every snap of a twig made me jump. I'd been in the woods enough to know how easy it was to let fear take over, so I focused on moving steadily and efficiently. By the time night fell, I still hadn't found my way back. My headlamp cast a weak beam that barely pierced the darkness. I stumbled on roots and rocks, my nerves fraying with every step. Finally, I decided to stop and set up a makeshift camp. I always carried an emergency bivy sack, so I found a relatively flat spot, cleared away debris, and crawled inside. I didn't light a fire. The thought of drawing attention to myself in an unfamiliar area felt wrong, though I couldn't explain why. The night was long and terrifying. Every sound seemed amplified. The crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the distant howl of what I hoped was a coyote. I barely slept, and when dawn finally came, I felt exhausted but relieved to see the light. I resumed walking, sticking to a single direction to avoid going in circles. The forest was dense and disorienting, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Several times, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was nothing there. I told myself it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. Around midday, I stumbled upon something that made my stomach drop. It was a campsite, but it wasn't mine. The tent was old and tattered, half collapsed, with moss growing on the fabric. Rusty cooking utensils were scattered around, and a moldy sleeping bag lay crumpled near the fire pit. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. I felt an overwhelming urge to leave, but I was so tired and hungry that I decided to stop and rest for a bit. As I sat there, eating a granola bar, I noticed something carved into a nearby tree. It was a series of symbols I didn't recognize, followed by what looked like tally marks. There were dozens of them, etched deep into the bark. A chill ran down my spine, and I quickly packed up and moved on. The rest of the day was a blur of walking and fighting off rising panic. My water supply was running low, and I hadn't seen any streams or rivers. My legs ached, and blisters formed on my feet. I started to doubt my ability to find my way out. The thought of being lost out here indefinitely was unbearable. That night, I didn't bother setting up any kind of shelter. I just sat with my back against a tree, clutching my knife for comfort. Sleep was out of the question. Around midnight, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere behind me. They stopped when I turned my head, and the silence that followed was deafening. I didn't move, barely dared to breathe, and after what felt like hours, I heard the footsteps retreating into the distance. The next morning, I forced myself to keep moving, though my body felt like it was on the verge of collapse. The forest seemed endless, every tree identical to the last. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I saw a flash of something bright through the trees. It was the sun reflecting off metal. I stumbled toward it and nearly cried with relief when I realized it was my car. I don't remember much about the drive home. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely keep the wheel steady. When I finally got back to my apartment, I locked the door and collapsed onto the floor, too exhausted to even take off my boots. It's been weeks since that trip, and I still can't stop thinking about it. I've gone over every detail, trying to make sense of what happened. I don't know who or what was out there with me, and part of me doesn't want to know. All I know is that I'll never go back into the woods alone again. I had planned this camping trip for weeks. It was my first time heading out alone into the wilderness, something I'd always wanted to do but had never worked up the courage for. It was late summer, and the weather was perfect, cool in the mornings and evenings, but warm during the day. I picked a spot in a remote part of the state, miles away from any towns or paved roads. The solitude was what I craved, or at least I thought it was. The drive out there took about 3 hours. The last stretch was on a dirt road that seemed to go on forever, winding through dense woods with no sign of another soul. I parked my car at the edge of the trailhead, unloaded my gear, and double-checked that I had everything: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a map, and my trusty knife. I had no cell service, but that was part of the appeal. I wanted to disconnect from the world and reconnect with nature. The hike to the campsite was about 6 miles. The trail was narrow but well-marked, cutting through thick forest that seemed to grow quieter the further I went. First, I enjoyed the peace. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. But as the trees closed in around me, the silence started to feel oppressive. I shook it off, telling myself I was just adjusting to being alone. I reached the campsite in the late afternoon. It was a small clearing near a shallow stream, just as described in the guidebook. The spot was perfect, surrounded by tall pines and far from any other trails. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and got a small fire going as the sun dipped below the horizon. The woods transformed as darkness fell. Shadows stretched and deepened, and the sounds of the forest came alive. Crickets chirped, and the occasional hoot of an owl echoed through the trees. It was peaceful, but also a little unnerving. After dinner, I sat by the fire, staring into the flames and letting my mind wander. I felt a mix of pride and unease. I had made it out here on my own, but the isolation was more intense than I had imagined. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. I reminded myself that I was miles away from anyone. There was nothing to be afraid of. I crawled into my tent around 10 p.m., leaving the fire to burn down to embers. The night was cool, and the ground beneath my sleeping bag was hard but manageable. I drifted off to the sound of the stream and the occasional chirp of crickets. It took me longer than usual to fall asleep, but eventually I did. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had stirred me. I lay still, listening. The woods were quieter now, almost eerily so. The crickets had stopped, and the only sound was the faint trickle of the stream. My heart began to race. Something felt off. Then I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like leaves being disturbed. It was subtle, almost indistinguishable from the natural sounds of the forest, but it was there. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon, but the sound didn't move away. It stayed in one spot just outside my tent. I sat up slowly, trying not to make any noise. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. The rustling continued, followed by a faint, deliberate crunch of footsteps. Human footsteps. My stomach dropped. I stayed frozen, straining to hear more. Whoever it was, they were trying to be quiet, but the stillness of the night betrayed them. The footsteps circled my tent, slow and measured. My mind raced. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere? The thought of some random hiker didn't add up. No one would stumble upon this spot by accident. I debated what to do. Should I call out? Let them know I was armed? Should I stay silent and hope they'd go away? My mouth was dry, and my hands trembled. Then, the footsteps stopped, and the silence was deafening. Minutes passed. I didn't dare move. My ears strained for any sound, but there was nothing. Just when I began to think they might have left, I heard the unmistakable sound of my backpack being unzipped. It was outside, leaning against a tree. Whoever it was had gone through my things. That's when anger started to override my fear. My supplies were crucial for surviving out here. I couldn't let someone take them. Still gripping my knife, I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and peered out. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, casting a faint light across the clearing. I didn't see anyone at first. Then, a figure emerged from the shadows, crouched over my backpack. They were wearing dark clothing and had their back to me. I couldn't make out any details, but they looked wiry and agile. My heart pounded as I debated my next move. Before I could decide, they stood up abruptly, holding something in their hand. It was my water bottle. They turned and scanned the area, their face obscured by a hood. I ducked back into the tent, my mind racing. I needed to scare them off, but I didn't want to confront them directly. I grabbed the whistle from my emergency kit and blew it as hard as I could. The shrill sound pierced the night, and I heard the figure curse loudly before bolting into the woods. Their footsteps faded quickly, swallowed by the darkness. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Every sound made me jump, and I kept my knife within arm's reach. When the first light of dawn broke, I packed up my gear in record time. My backpack had been rummaged through, but nothing was missing except for the water bottle. I felt a mix of relief and lingering fear as I hiked back to my car, constantly glancing over my shoulder. When I finally reached the trailhead, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The sight of my car was almost overwhelming. I loaded up my gear and got out of there as fast as I could. The drive back to civilization felt surreal, like I was leaving a bad dream behind. I still think about that night sometimes, wondering who that person was and what they wanted. Maybe they were just a thief, looking for supplies. Or maybe their intentions were darker. I'll never know, and maybe that's for the best. One thing's for sure, I'll never camp alone again. I always thought of myself as an experienced camper. Over the years, I had explored countless trails, pitched tents in all kinds of weather, and cooked over a campfire more times than I could count. So when I decided to spend a long weekend camping alone in a remote part of the wilderness, I felt confident. Maybe too confident. It was the kind of confidence that blinds you to small warnings, subtle signs that something might not go as planned. The area I chose was a dense forest known for its isolation. It wasn't the kind of place that drew crowds. Most people preferred the well-marked trails and family-friendly campsites closer to town. But I wanted solitude. I craved the quiet and the feeling of being completely cut off from the rest of the world. It was late September, the perfect time of year for camping. The air was crisp but not freezing, and the leaves were just starting to turn. I packed everything I thought I'd need. A sturdy tent, enough food for 3 days, a first aid kit, and a high-quality GPS device. I even brought a portable solar charger for my phone, though I doubted I'd use it much. The drive to the trailhead took about 3 hours, the last hour on a bumpy dirt road that seemed to stretch endlessly into the forest. When I finally arrived, there wasn't another car in sight. Perfect. I locked my car, shouldered my backpack, and set off. The trail was narrow and rugged, winding through thick trees that blocked most of the sunlight. Occasionally, I'd spot a squirrel darting across the path or hear the distant call of a bird, but otherwise, it was silent. After hiking for about 5 miles, I found a clearing by a small stream and decided it would make a good campsite. The ground was flat, and the stream provided easy access to water. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the area. There was no sign of anyone else having been there recently. No trash, no footprints, nothing. It was exactly what I had hoped for. That first night was uneventful. I cooked a simple meal over the fire and sat staring at the flames until the cold drove me into my tent. I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the soothing sound of the stream. The next morning, I woke up feeling refreshed and eager to explore more of the forest. I packed a day bag with water, snacks, and my GPS, then set off. I didn't plan to go far, just a few miles out and back. The forest was beautiful that morning. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the ground. I followed an animal trail that twisted and turned through the underbrush, occasionally stopping to admire a particularly vibrant patch of moss or an interesting tree formation. But as the hours passed, I started to feel uneasy. It wasn't anything specific at first, just a vague sense that something was off. The forest seemed too quiet. The bird song I'd heard earlier had stopped, and even the wind seemed to have stilled. I told myself it was just my imagination and kept walking. Eventually, I decided it was time to head back. I checked my GPS to get my bearings and was surprised to see that I had wandered farther than I'd intended. Still, I wasn't worried. I had plenty of daylight left and a reliable way to navigate. But as I retraced my steps, that uneasy feeling grew stronger. I started to notice things I hadn't seen on the way out. A tree with deep gouges in its bark, a patch of ground where the leaves had been disturbed as if something heavy had passed through. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I finally made it back to camp, the sun was low in the sky, and the clearing was bathed in an orange glow. I was relieved to see my tent and gear exactly as I'd left them. But the relief was short-lived. As I prepared dinner, I noticed small things that seemed out of place. A rock near the fire pit that I didn't remember seeing before. A faint scuff mark on the ground near my tent. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, that I was just tired from the hike. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear a rustling noise outside the tent or the distant snap of a twig. I told myself it was just animals, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but the sounds didn't stop, and they seemed to be getting closer. At one point, I thought I heard breathing, low and steady, just outside the thin fabric of the tent. My heart pounded as I lay there, clutching my camping knife and straining to hear over the sound of my own pulse. Eventually, the noises stopped, and exhaustion overtook me. I fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I found more signs that something or someone had been near my camp. A few items had been moved ever so slightly. My water bottle was no longer where I'd left it, and a piece of firewood had been shifted. There were no footprints, no clear evidence of an intruder, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I decided to cut my trip short. As much as I hated to admit it, the isolation that had drawn me to this place now felt oppressive. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The hike back to the trailhead felt endless. Every sound, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the creak of a branch, set my nerves on edge. Several times, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but whenever I turned around, there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. I quickened my pace, driven by a growing sense of urgency. When I finally reached my car, I was drenched in sweat and trembling with relief. I threw my backpack into the trunk, climbed into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. As I started the engine and pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. But when I looked again, it was gone. I drove straight home without stopping, my mind racing the entire way. Even now, weeks later, I can't explain what happened out there. Maybe it was just paranoia, my mind playing tricks on me in the isolation of the wilderness. Or maybe someone really was out there watching me. I'll never know for sure. But one thing is certain. I won't be camping alone again anytime soon. It was late summer when I decided to take a solo camping trip. I had always loved the outdoors and found it peaceful to be surrounded by nothing but trees, the sounds of nature, and the occasional rustle of wildlife. This time, I chose a remote spot in the mountains. It wasn't an official campground, just a clearing I had stumbled upon during a hike a few years back. It was miles from the nearest trailhead and completely off the grid. Perfect for a weekend of solitude. I arrived mid-morning on a Saturday, my old backpack heavy with gear. The air was crisp, the sky a perfect blue, and the forest smelled of pine and damp earth. It was the kind of day that made you forget about everything else. I parked my car at a dirt pull-off and started the hike in, following a faint trail that wound deeper into the woods. The path became harder to distinguish the further I went, but I had my bearings. I'd been here before and had marked my route on a map. By early afternoon, I reached the clearing. It was just as I remembered. A small patch of flat ground surrounded by tall pines, with a narrow stream running along one side. The sunlight dappled through the leaves, and the only sounds were the burbling water and the occasional chirp of birds. I set down my pack and began setting up camp. My tent went up quickly, and I arranged my gear neatly inside. After gathering some wood for a fire later, I decided to explore the area a bit. The forest was dense, and I had to duck under low-hanging branches and step carefully over roots and rocks. The stream widened a little further downstream, forming a shallow pool. I knelt by the edge, splashing my face with the cold, clear water. Felt refreshing after the hike in. As I straightened up, I noticed something odd about the area. The trees here seemed older, their trunks thicker, their branches gnarled. It was darker too, with the canopy blocking out most of the sunlight. The air felt cooler, almost damp. Shrugging it off, I made my way back to camp. The rest of the afternoon passed uneventfully. I read a book, ate a simple meal of trail mix and jerky, and relaxed by the stream. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, I lit the fire. The crackling flames brought a comforting warmth and light to the clearing. Nightfall in the wilderness was always something special. The sky was a blanket of stars, brighter than you'd ever see in the city. I sat by the fire, listening to the forest. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves, the distant howl of a coyote. It wasn't until I decided to turn in for the night that I noticed something strange. As I doused the fire and zipped up my tent, I felt a faint unease. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was there, lingering at the edges of my thoughts. Maybe it was just the solitude getting to me. I crawled into my sleeping bag and closed my eyes, determined to get a good night's rest. The first sound woke me sometime after midnight, a soft, rhythmic crunching. It was faint but distinct, the sound of footsteps on dry leaves. I froze, my ears straining in the darkness. The sound stopped. I held my breath, waiting. Nothing. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was probably an animal. A deer, maybe, or a raccoon. The forest was full of creatures, after all. I rolled over and tried to go back to sleep, but the sound came again. This time it was closer. Crunch, crunch. It was deliberate, not the scurry of a small animal, but the measured steps of something or someone. My heart began to pound. I reached for the flashlight beside my sleeping bag, fumbling to turn it on. The beam of light pierced the darkness, illuminating the interior of my tent. The sound stopped again. I listened, my pulse hammering in my ears. The silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive. I thought about unzipping the tent and shining the light outside, but the thought of what I might see made me hesitate. Minutes passed, maybe longer. The footsteps didn't return, and eventually, I convinced myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the first light of dawn filtered through the tent fabric, I unzipped the door and stepped out. The forest looked peaceful, almost serene, in the soft morning light. I felt silly for being so scared the night before. After breakfast, I decided to check around the clearing. There were no signs of anyone else, no footprints, no trampled grass. Maybe I had overreacted. The day passed uneventfully. I explored more of the area, took photos of the scenery, and even found a fallen log to sit on while I sketched the stream. By the time evening rolled around, I felt completely at ease again. I built another fire and cooked a simple meal. As the flames flickered and the stars came out, I told myself I was being paranoid. It was easy to let your mind wander in the isolation of the wilderness. That night, I made sure to secure my tent and keep my flashlight within reach. I drifted off to sleep, the crackling fire outside providing a sense of security. I don't know how long I slept before I woke up again. This time, it wasn't a sound that woke me, but a feeling. A heavy, oppressive sensation, like being watched. I lay still, my heart racing. Then I heard it, a faint rustling, followed by that same deliberate crunch of footsteps. This time, they circled the tent. My throat went dry. I clutched the flashlight but didn't turn it on. The footsteps paused, then resumed, moving around me in a slow, deliberate circle. My mind raced. Who could be out here? There was no reason for anyone to be this far off the trail. I stayed frozen, every muscle tense, listening as the footsteps moved closer. Then they stopped, right outside my tent. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and rapid, as I waited for whatever came next. The silence was unbearable. Then came a sound that made my blood run cold. A faint, low scratching, like nails dragging across the tent fabric. It was slow, deliberate, and unrelenting. My grip tightened on the flashlight, but I didn't move. I didn't dare. The scratching continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The forest was silent again, save for the distant rustle of leaves in the wind. I lay there, unmoving, until the first light of dawn. When I finally worked up the courage to unzip the tent and step outside, the clearing was empty. There were no footprints, no sign that anyone or anything had been there. But I wasn't taking any chances. I packed up my gear in record time and started the hike back to my car. The forest felt different that morning. The birds were quieter, the air heavier. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me. By the time I reached my car, my nerves were frayed. I tossed my gear into the back seat and got out of there as fast as I could. Even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling of being watched. I've gone over that night 100 times in my head, trying to make sense of it. Was it just my imagination? Some overactive fear of the dark? Or was there really someone out there, circling my tent, watching me from the shadows? I don't know. And honestly, I don't want to find out. One thing's for sure, I won't be camping alone again anytime soon. I decided to spend a weekend camping alone in the Adirondacks. I've always loved the outdoors, and solitude is something I've learned to embrace over the years. I was looking forward to a quiet weekend away from the noise of the city. Just me, my tent, and the wilderness. I had chosen a spot deep in the woods, far from the popular trails, to ensure I wouldn't encounter other campers. The idea of complete isolation appealed to me. I arrived at the trailhead early Friday morning, my backpack filled with all the essentials: food, water, a small first aid kit, and a good sleeping bag to ward off the cold. The hike to my chosen campsite was about 5 miles, and the weather was perfect. Crisp autumn air with just a hint of frost. The forest was alive with color, the trees a mix of red, orange, and yellow. The sound of leaves crunching under my boots was the only noise accompanying me. The hike was uneventful but demanding. By the time I reached the clearing where I planned to set up camp, the sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky. The spot was perfect, a flat, open area surrounded by dense trees, with a small stream running nearby for water. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and started a small fire to cook dinner. As the light faded, the forest grew eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or distant call of an owl. I felt a sense of peace wash over me. After dinner, I sat by the fire for a while, enjoying the warmth and watching the flames dance. The stars were brighter than I had seen in a long time, the kind of view you only get far away from city lights. I felt completely at ease. Eventually, the fatigue from the hike caught up with me, and I decided to call it a night. I crawled into my tent, zipped up the sleeping bag, and drifted off to sleep to the sound of the stream trickling nearby. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had disturbed me. The fire had long since died out, and the inside of the tent was pitch black. I lay still, listening. That's when I heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound, like footsteps crunching on the forest floor. My heart started to race. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the steps sounded deliberate, too heavy to belong to a small animal. I stayed frozen, straining to hear more. The steps grew louder, closer. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't in a hurry. They moved slowly, almost methodically, as if they were searching for something. I've camped enough to know the sounds of the forest, and this wasn't normal. I thought about calling out, but something told me to stay silent. I didn't want to give away my presence. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. My breath caught in my throat. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. I stared at the fabric of the tent, half expecting to see a shadow or hear a voice, but there was nothing. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, and then the steps started again, moving away this time. I waited until I could no longer hear them before allowing myself to breathe normally. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I cautiously unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The ground was damp with dew, and the forest looked as serene as ever, but I couldn't shake the unease from the night before. I looked around the campsite for any signs of what or who might have been there, but found nothing unusual. No footprints, no disturbed bushes, nothing to suggest that anyone had been near my tent. I debated whether to pack up and leave or stick to my original plan of staying the weekend. Part of me felt silly, it was probably just an animal after all. But another part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. In the end, I decided to stay. I had looked forward to this trip for weeks, and I wasn't ready to let one strange night ruin it. The rest of the day was uneventful. I hiked to a nearby ridge for some stunning views, gathered more firewood, and even managed to relax a bit by the stream. By the time evening rolled around, I felt more at ease. I started another fire, cooked dinner, and watched the stars come out. The forest was quiet again, but this time, the silence felt oppressive rather than peaceful. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I double-checked the tent zippers and made sure my flashlight and knife were within reach. I tried to fall asleep, but every little noise outside seemed amplified. At some point, exhaustion overtook my anxiety, and I drifted off. I woke up again in the middle of the night, and this time the sound was different. It wasn't footsteps. It was a low, guttural noise, like someone's labored breathing. The sound was coming from just outside the tent. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed. The breathing grew louder, more ragged, and then stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. I lay there, clutching my knife, too scared to move or make a sound. Minutes passed, and then I heard the footsteps again, retreating into the woods. When morning came, I packed up my campsite as quickly as I could. I didn't care that I had planned to stay another night. I just wanted to get out of there. The hike back to the trailhead felt longer than it had on the way in. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made my heart race. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me, but the trail remained empty. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I threw my gear in the trunk and got in, locking the doors behind me. As I drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I still don't know who or what was out there that weekend, but one thing is certain: I'll think twice before camping alone again. I decided to go camping alone in the mountains for a weekend. It wasn't something I'd done before, but I'd always wanted to. The idea of being surrounded by nature, away from the noise of the city, sounded peaceful. I spent days preparing. I packed everything I thought I'd need: a tent, sleeping bag, enough food and water for 3 days, a small camping stove, a flashlight, and a first aid kit. I even brought a book, thinking I'd have time to sit and read by the fire. The drive to the mountains was uneventful. The road wound through thick forests, and the further I went, the fewer cars I saw. By the time I reached the trailhead, mine was the only vehicle in the parking area. It was late morning, and the sun was shining, casting dappled light through the trees. I strapped on my backpack and started up the trail, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. The trail was steep in places, but it was well-marked and easy to follow. I walked for hours, stopping occasionally to catch my breath and drink water. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. At one point, I saw a deer standing off the trail, watching me with curious eyes before bounding away. It was everything I'd hoped for. By mid-afternoon, I reached the spot I'd picked out on the map. It was a small clearing near a stream, surrounded by tall pines. I set up my tent, unpacked my gear, and collected some firewood. As the sun started to dip lower in the sky, I lit a small fire and cooked dinner. Sitting there, eating and listening to the sounds of the forest, I felt a sense of calm I hadn't experienced in years. That night, I crawled into my tent and zipped up the door. It was pitch black outside, and the only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the tent's ceiling, feeling both isolated and connected to the world in a way I couldn't quite describe. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. I lay still, listening. The forest was quiet, too quiet. The crickets had stopped, and there was no wind. My heart started to pound as I strained to hear something, anything. Then I heard it, a faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but the footsteps sounded deliberate, like someone trying to move quietly. They were slow, uneven, and getting closer. I reached for my flashlight and turned it on, shining the beam toward the tent's door. The light made me feel a little safer, but I couldn't see anything outside. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, listening. The silence was deafening. Minutes passed, or maybe it was just seconds. It was hard to tell. Then, there was a loud snap, like a branch breaking, not far from my tent. I jumped and almost dropped the flashlight. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a bear? Person? Should I stay inside the tent or get out and look? I decided to stay put. I didn't want to risk running into whatever was out there. I grabbed the small camping knife I'd brought with me and held it tightly. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I sat there, clutching the knife and flashlight, until the first light of dawn started to filter through the trees. When it was fully light, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The forest looked peaceful, as if nothing had happened. I walked around the campsite, looking for signs of what might have been there. Near the edge of the clearing, I found footprints in the dirt. They were human, not animal. My stomach dropped. The prints were fresh, and they led away from the campsite, disappearing into the trees. I debated packing up and leaving right then, but I told myself it could have been another hiker passing through. Maybe they hadn't seen my tent and didn't mean to scare me. I tried to shake off the unease and went about my day. I spent the morning exploring the area, staying close to the campsite. The stream was clear and cold, and I found a spot where I could sit and dip my feet in the water. For a while, I felt okay, but the unease crept back as the day went on. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling like I was being watched. I told myself I was imagining things, but I couldn't shake the feeling. By the time the sun started to set, I was on edge. I built a larger fire that night, hoping it would keep animals or people away. I didn't go inside the tent right away, instead sitting by the fire and staring into the darkness beyond its glow. I thought I saw movement in the shadows several times, but it was always at the edge of my vision. When I turned to look, there was nothing there. I tried to convince myself it was just the flickering firelight playing tricks on my eyes. Eventually, I couldn't keep my eyes open any longer. I put out the fire and crawled into the tent, leaving the flashlight and knife within arm's reach. That night was worse than the first. I woke up multiple times, each time convinced I'd heard something outside. I didn't dare open the tent or make any noise. I just lay there, heart racing, listening to the sounds of the forest. At one point, I thought I heard whispering, but it was so faint I couldn't be sure. I stayed awake until dawn, too scared to close my eyes. When morning came, I decided I'd had enough. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could and started back down the trail. The sense of relief I felt as I left the campsite was overwhelming. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but the trail behind me was always empty. About halfway back to the parking lot, I found something that made my blood run cold. Stuck to a tree next to the trail was a piece of paper. It was dirty and crumpled, but I could make out the words written on it. "You're lucky." I didn't stop to think. I ran the rest of the way back to my car, not caring about the weight of my backpack or the pain in my legs. When I reached the parking lot, I threw my gear into the car and locked the doors. I sat there for a few minutes, catching my breath and trying to calm down, before starting the engine and driving away. I've thought about that trip many times since. I don't know who or what was out there, and I don't want to know. I haven't been camping since, and I don't think I ever will again. I had always loved the solitude of camping. There's something about being alone in the wilderness that clears your mind and makes you feel alive. So when I had a free weekend, I packed up my gear and drove out to a remote area in the mountains. It was a spot I had scouted on a hiking trip years ago, far from any marked trails and miles from the nearest sign of civilization. The weather was perfect: clear skies, cool air, and just a whisper of wind. The drive to the trailhead took a few hours, and from there it was a grueling hike up a narrow, rocky path. My backpack was heavy with supplies, but I felt good. By mid-afternoon, I reached a small clearing near a stream where I decided to set up camp. The place was perfect. Tall pines surrounded the clearing, and the sound of the water was soothing. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and took a moment to soak in the quiet. As the sun began to set, the forest came alive with its usual symphony. Crickets chirped, and the occasional rustle of leaves hinted at small animals moving through the underbrush. I built a small fire and cooked a simple meal. The warmth of the flames felt good against the cooling air, and I leaned back against a log, staring up at the stars. It was the kind of peace you can only find out there, away from everything. Around 9, I decided to call it a night. I doused the fire thoroughly, double-checked my gear, and crawled into my tent. The sleeping bag was warm, and the sound of the stream nearby lulled me to sleep almost instantly. I don't know how long I slept, but something woke me in the middle of the night. At first, I thought it was just the usual sounds of the forest, maybe a branch snapping or a bird taking flight. But then I noticed the distinct crunch of footsteps on the dry leaves outside my tent. My body tensed, and my heart started pounding. I lay perfectly still, straining to hear more. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and close. Whoever it was, they were just outside my campsite. My first thought was that it might be an animal, but the steps were too heavy for that. They sounded human. I grabbed the knife I always kept in my sleeping bag for emergencies and tried to calm my breathing. The steps circled the tent, pausing every few seconds as if whoever it was listening or looking for something. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was another camper who had lost their way, but this area was so remote that it seemed unlikely. And why would they be sneaking around my tent in the middle of the night? Minutes felt like hours as the footsteps continued. At one point, they stopped right outside the entrance of my tent. I could see the faint shadow of movement through the thin fabric. My grip on the knife tightened, and I prepared myself for the worst. But then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps retreated. I listened as they grew fainter and eventually disappeared into the forest. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. As soon as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I unzipped my tent and stepped out cautiously. The clearing looked exactly as I had left it, but the ground around my tent told a different story. There were fresh footprints in the dirt, large and unmistakably human. They circled my campsite and led off into the woods. I debated what to do. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but I convinced myself that whoever it was had probably moved on. Maybe it was just some weirdo passing through. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that I was overreacting. After all, nothing had actually happened. I spent the day exploring the area, fishing in the stream, and trying to enjoy myself. But the unease lingered. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves set me on edge. By the time evening came, I was questioning my decision to stay. Still, I told myself I was being paranoid and decided to stick it out for one more night. As darkness fell, I built a larger fire than usual and kept my knife close at hand. I even set up a makeshift alarm by tying some empty cans to a length of cord and stringing it around the perimeter of my campsite. It wasn't much, but it made me feel a little safer. The night dragged on, and I found myself jumping at every little sound. Around midnight, I thought I heard something in the distance, a faint rustling, followed by the unmistakable crunch of footsteps. My stomach turned to ice. The steps were slow and deliberate, just like the night before. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the sound, but the beam only illuminated the trees and underbrush. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Then they stopped. I held my breath, listening intently. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the clatter of cans from my makeshift alarm. Whoever it was had triggered the line. My adrenaline surged as I pointed the flashlight toward the noise, but all I could see were the cans swinging on the cord. I shouted out, trying to sound braver than I felt, but there was no response. The forest was eerily silent now, as if even the animals were holding their breath. I didn't dare move. Minutes passed, then an hour. Finally, I convinced myself that whoever it was had been scared off by the noise. I stayed up the rest of the night, clutching my knife and flashlight, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally came, I didn't waste any time. I packed up my gear as quickly as possible and started the hike back to my car. Every step of the way, I felt like I was being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me, but the trail remained empty. When I finally reached my car, I threw my backpack in the trunk and locked the doors before collapsing into the driver's seat. My hands were shaking as I started the engine and drove away. I didn't relax until I was miles down the road, leaving the mountains behind. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there with me. I've gone camping since, but I'm much more cautious now. I stick to established campsites and never go alone. That weekend was a stark reminder that the wilderness isn't the only thing to be afraid of out there. It started as a trip to disconnect from the world. I wanted some time away from the endless buzz of emails, notifications, and meetings. Living in the city had become suffocating, so I planned a solo camping trip deep in the wilderness. I had done my homework, picked a spot in a remote national park, and packed everything I thought I might need: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and all the gear to ensure I could handle a few nights on my own. It was supposed to be peaceful. The drive to the trailhead took most of the morning. The roads narrowed as I left the highways behind, eventually turning into gravel paths that snaked through thick forests. I reached the parking lot around noon, strapped on my backpack, and locked the car. The air smelled fresh, like pine and earth, and I felt the tension in my shoulders ease as I started hiking. The trail was well marked but steep in places. It wound through dense woods, past towering trees whose branches seemed to form a canopy over my head. I saw a few birds flitting between the branches, heard the occasional rustle in the underbrush, and even spotted a deer grazing in the distance. It was exactly what I'd hoped for: quiet and untouched by the noise of civilization. After about 5 miles, I reached my chosen campsite. It was a small clearing near a stream, just big enough for my tent and a little fire pit. I set up my tent quickly, laying out my gear and making sure everything was in place. The stream's gentle gurgling filled the air, a soothing backdrop to my work. Once the tent was up, I gathered some firewood, set up my portable stove, and made a quick meal. By the time I finished eating, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing. The first night was uneventful. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the forest. Crickets chirped, the stream bubbled, and every so often, I'd hear a distant rustle, probably a raccoon or some other small animal. It was a bit eerie being so far from anyone else, but I reminded myself that I'd come here for solitude. Eventually, I fell asleep. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. I left most of my gear in the tent, taking only a small day pack with some essentials: water, snacks, a map, and a compass. The forest was beautiful in the daylight, the sunlight filtering through the leaves and creating patterns on the forest floor. I followed the stream for a while, marveling at how clear the water was. It wasn't until midday that I noticed something odd. There was a faint smell in the air, something sour and metallic. I couldn't quite place it, but it seemed out of place in the otherwise fresh forest. As I walked further, I found the source. A small animal, a rabbit, I think, was lying near the edge of the stream. It was dead, its body twisted in a way that didn't seem natural. There was no obvious sign of injury, no blood, just the stiff, lifeless form. I felt a chill run down my spine, but told myself it was probably just nature's way. Animals die all the time. I moved on, but the sight stuck with me. The rest of the day felt different, as if the forest had shifted somehow. The birds seemed quieter, and the air felt heavier. When I returned to my campsite, I was relieved to find everything exactly as I'd left it. I made another simple meal, lit a fire, and tried to shake off the unease. Night fell quickly, and soon I was back in my tent, the fire's embers glowing faintly outside. That night, I woke up to a sound. It was faint at first, a rhythmic crunching that seemed to be coming from the woods. My heart raced as I lay there, straining to hear. Could have been an animal, maybe a deer walking through the underbrush, but it sounded too deliberate, like footsteps. I reached for my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire had gone out, and the clearing was bathed in darkness. I couldn't see anything, but the sound continued, circling the campsite. I froze, unsure of what to do. Eventually, the noise stopped, and after what felt like hours, I fell back asleep. The next morning, I found nothing unusual around the campsite. No tracks, no signs that anyone or anything had been there. I told myself I'd imagined it, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I decided to stay close to camp that day, gathering more firewood and double-checking my gear. I made sure my knife was within reach and kept my flashlight and a whistle in my pocket. As the day wore on, the forest grew quieter. By evening, even the stream's gurgling seemed muted. I lit a larger fire that night, hoping the light would keep whatever was out there at bay. I sat by the fire for hours, listening and watching, but nothing happened. Eventually, exhaustion got the better of me, and I retreated to my tent. I don't know what time it was when I woke up again, but this time, the sound was louder. It wasn't just footsteps. There was a rustling, like something moving through the bushes. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it outside, sweeping the beam across the clearing. For a moment, I thought I saw something at the edge of the light. A figure, maybe, but it was gone before I could be sure. My hands shook as I clutched the flashlight, scanning the darkness. The sound stopped again, but I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By morning, I'd made up my mind to leave. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to stick around to find out. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my eyes darting to the tree line every few seconds. The forest felt oppressive now, the trees looming over me like silent sentinels. As I started back down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The hike back to the car was tense. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the underbrush made me jump. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger with every step. When I finally reached the parking lot, I was nearly running. My car was the only one there, just as I'd left it. I threw my gear into the trunk, jumped into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. My hands were still shaking as I started the engine and drove away. It wasn't until I was miles away, back on the main road, that the tension began to ease. I still don't know what I experienced out there. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, amplified by the isolation and the unfamiliar sounds of the forest. Or maybe there was something or someone out there watching me. Either way, I haven't been camping since.